Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're time traveling again, back to a world of olive groves, marble columns, and endless philosophical debates. Ancient Greece. Sounds kind of romantic, right? Sun-kissed temples, toga parties, Plato pondering deep truths while sipping wine. Yeah, not quite. See, the real ancient Greece, the one your history teacher kind of glossed over, was brutal, harsh. And if you think you could survive even a single day in their sandals, you might want to buckle up. Let's just start with the basics. Imagine waking up in the cramped, smoky interior of a one-room home. The air is thick with ash from last night's fire, and your pillow is basically a rolled-up wool tunic. There's no mattress, just woven mats on a dirt floor. If you're a man, you might get up and head out into the blinding sun to chop wood, fetch water, or, if you're lucky, go to the agora to sell olives or pottery shards. If you're a woman, you're probably staying in the back of the house, the gynaeceum, working dough or weaving until your fingers ache. Forget showers. There's no soap like we know it. Hygiene, that's a maybe. You might splash some cold water on your face, scrape yourself clean with a strigil, and sprinkle olive oil mixed with ash or scented resin on your skin. No toothpaste, no deodorant, no floss. Your breath. Let's just say mint wasn't an option, and you're hungry. But breakfast isn't pancakes or scrambled eggs, it's a small chunk of barley bread dipped in wine. That's it. Wine for breakfast. Yep, diluted but still. You're drinking it because water could kill you. It wasn't filtered, chlorinated, or even reliable. So wine was your safest bet morning to night. Let's talk about your clothes. You've got maybe one or two garments ever. A simple tunic called a chiton, possibly belted with rope. If you're wealthy, you might have dyed fabric. If you're poor, it's basic, itchy, and definitely not tailored. And if you're a woman, you better not be caught with your arms showing in public unless you want gossip to spread like wildfire. Still think you're ready for a day in this world? All right, let's head to the city center. You walk along uneven stone streets that double as sewer lines when it rains. The sun is punishing. You've got no sunglasses, no hat, and sandals, if you're lucky. Some folks just went barefoot. Every step could mean a stubbed toe, a sharp rock, or worse, someone else's trash, waste, or even animal dung. You finally reach the agora, the bustling heart of the city. It's chaotic. Vendors yelling, slaves running errands, philosophers debating loudly about whether reality is even real. You're trying to trade your olive oil for some salted fish, but you get shoved aside by a soldier with a spear. No apologies, just survival of the fittest. And don't even think about speaking out of turn. In Athens, only male citizens could vote or debate. Women, slaves, foreigners, out of luck. Even if you're a guy, you'd better be over 18 and born to Athenian parents if you want to say. Otherwise, you're just a spectator. Oh, and let's say you're actually a woman in this world. Think you're walking around freely, shopping, socializing, or taking in the sights. Not a chance. Respectable women were expected to stay indoors out of the public eye. Your job: raise kids, tend the home, and hope your husband doesn't die in battle. Education: maybe if your father was progressive. Freedom: practically none. Speaking of battle, hope you're not of military age. Because military service wasn't optional, it was expected. If you're a young man, you're probably training as a hoplite, hauling a 70-pound shield and marching in a phalanx formation under the scorching sun. Think of it as ancient CrossFit, but with real swords. One wrong step and you're crushed or speared by your own allies. And those polished bronze helmets, they looked cool but turned your skull into a slow-roasting pot. You come home exhausted, maybe wounded, and there's no Tylenol, no antibiotics. Medicine, that's herbs, wine, leeches, and the occasional wild guess. If your leg's infected, they might burn it shut. If you break a bone, hope someone knows how to set it. If you're in pain, suck it up or drink more wine and pray to Asclepius, the god of healing. And let's be honest, there's little escape in your off time either. You might go to the theater if you're in Athens, but remember, most plays were all-day affairs, often tragic and frequently political. The good seats go to the elites, women and slaves, not invited. So you're standing, crammed with sweaty bodies, watching a chorus in masks sing about fate and suffering. Dinner rolls around, and what's on the menu? Barley porridge, maybe beans, onions, or salted fish if you're lucky. Meat, only on festival days. And that wine you've been sipping all day, still going strong. But if you overdo it, you better hope you don't pass out on the street, because there's no ER and there are plenty of thieves. You fall into bed, if you can call a woven mat a bed, aching, hungry, maybe drunk, maybe wounded, and definitely worn out. And that's just one day. Still think you'd make it. But here's the thing. For them, this was normal. This was life. They weren't surviving one day. They were surviving lifetimes like this. And despite all that hardship, ancient Greece gave us architecture, philosophy, drama, astronomy, and ideas that shaped entire civilizations. That's what makes it all so compelling. They lived with less, far less, but somehow managed to imagine more. So yeah, you might not last a day in ancient Greece, but you can still admire what they built, what they believed, and how they endured. But what if you got sick in ancient Greece? Let's say you caught a fever, broke a bone, or came down with something mysterious. Chills, sweats, confusion. There were no hospitals like we know today, no emergency room, and definitely no doctors with white coats and stethoscopes. Instead, you'd find yourself at the mercy of local healers, or more often, your own family's guesswork. Your neighbor might suggest a poultice made of boiled cabbage leaves. Someone else might prescribe drinking vinegar mixed with crushed herbs and honey. If things got serious, you'd go see a physicos, part doctor, part philosopher. He might bleed you with a knife to balance your humors, or maybe recommend vomiting as a cure. Now, if you lived in a big city like Athens or Corinth, you might be lucky enough to know someone who studied Hippocratic medicine. Hippocrates, yeah, the guy behind the Hippocratic Oath, had some ideas that weren't completely off base. He believed that sickness wasn't just punishment from the gods, but something connected to diet, lifestyle, and environment. That was radical at the time. Still, his treatments weren't always pleasant. Think purging. Think long fasts. Think lying in bed, swatting flies, drinking boiled barley water for days on end. There were no painkillers, no sterile instruments. And surgery, that was usually a last resort, and often a death sentence. If things got spiritual, you might head to a temple of Asclepius, the god of healing. But you didn't walk in expecting a cure. First, you had to purify yourself, maybe through fasting, a ritual bath, or an offering. Then you'd sleep overnight on a stone slab, hoping for a healing dream. Whatever you dreamed, priests would interpret it the next morning and use that as a guide for your treatment. Imagine being told your broken leg would heal only if you sacrifice a rooster or recite prayers for 3 days straight while bathing in goat's milk. Now let's say you survived that. Let's say you didn't die of infection or fever or misdiagnosis. You're better, but you're still not safe. Because in ancient Greece, danger wasn't limited to illness. It was baked into the rhythms of daily life. Natural disasters were common. Earthquakes could flatten towns. Crops failed regularly. Plagues swept through cities like fire through dry brush. War was constant. Bandits roamed the countryside, and political tensions always simmering. Even your own community could turn on you. In Athens, one of the most enlightened cities in the world at the time, democracy had a dark edge. If people thought you were getting too powerful, too rich, or just too annoying, they could vote to exile you from the city for 10 years. This was called ostracism, and it wasn't reserved for criminals. It was for anyone perceived as a threat to the fragile balance of the state. Imagine living in a democracy where your neighbors could write your name on a piece of broken pottery. And just like that, you're kicked out of town with nothing but what you can carry. And justice. Let's talk about that. There were no lawyers. If you had a dispute, you went to court and represented yourself, or had a friend do it for you. Trials were often chaotic. Juries were massive, sometimes over 500 people, and they voted by dropping bronze tokens into urns. Rich citizens could sway decisions with bribes, poor ones, good luck, and the penalties, brutal. You could be fined, whipped, enslaved, or executed. There wasn't much middle ground. Now you might be thinking, okay, but at least the Greeks were thinkers, right? Philosophers, dreamers. Absolutely, but even that wasn't easy. Let's say you're drawn to the life of the mind. You want to study with the greats, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. Well, good luck. Most formal education was reserved for upper-class boys. You'd spend years memorizing Homer, learning geometry, arguing rhetoric. Girls, not invited, and these debates, they weren't casual chats at coffee shops. They were intense, sometimes dangerous. Socrates, perhaps the most famous philosopher of all, was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth and impiety. His crime? Asking too many questions. So yes, the Greeks gave us democracy, science, drama, architecture, and philosophy. But they also gave us mob rule, public executions, and a deep suspicion of anyone who thought too differently. Now let's flip the coin. What if you were born a slave? That was your reality if you were captured in war, born into slavery, or sold by your parents out of desperation. You'd have no legal rights. You'd belong to someone. You could be worked to the bone in the fields, beaten, sold, or even killed with no recourse. And there were no laws protecting you. No chance at freedom unless your owner decided to grant it. You were considered property, not a person. Even the most brilliant thinkers, like Aristotle, believed slavery was a natural part of society. Brutal, right. And yet, despite it all, there were moments of beauty. Walk through the agora and you'd hear music drifting from lyres. Catch a festival and see dancers move like flame across temple steps. Visit a theater and watch actors in full costume performing stories of gods and mortals, fate and folly, all beneath the open sky. People laughed, cried, fell in love, broke bread together. They whispered prayers to the stars, offered figs to their household gods, and sang lullabies to their children. Because even in the grit and grime, in the chaos and cruelty, they lived. They found joy. And somehow from that world, raw and unfiltered, came ideas and art so powerful they still shape us today. So the next time you hear someone say, I wish I lived in ancient Greece, maybe pause and ask, do you really? Because unless you were rich, male, healthy, educated, and lucky, you probably wouldn't last a day. But maybe, just maybe, there's something in their struggle that calls to us. The hunger for meaning, the drive to create, the urge to ask hard questions and never stop seeking. That's where we'll pick up next. Let's say you made it through the politics, the plagues, and the philosophy. You've avoided being exiled, enslaved, or executed. You're alive. Now what? Well, now you've got to eat. But don't expect gyros or grilled octopus on a seaside patio. Ancient Greek cuisine was humble, very humble. Your daily menu would have centered around three things: barley, olives, and wine. That's it. Barley was the bread and butter, literally. Ground into flour, it was boiled into porridge or baked into coarse loaves. No yeast, no soft crust. This was survival bread, hard and dry. You dip it in olive oil or wine to soften it enough to chew. Speaking of wine, yes, it flowed, but not like you're picturing. Greeks always diluted their wine with water. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric. The goal wasn't to get drunk. It was to stay hydrated in a world where clean water wasn't always reliable. Protein, rare. Meat was expensive and usually reserved for sacrifices or special festivals. Most days your protein came from legumes, lentils, chickpeas, or maybe the occasional fish if you lived near the coast. Cheese made from goat's milk added some flavor, but it was more of a treat than a staple. And fruit, seasonal. If it wasn't fig season, too bad. No imports, no supermarkets, no citrus in December. The idea of 3 square meals didn't exist. You'd likely have a small bite in the morning, maybe some bread and cheese at midday, and a modest dinner at night. Hopefully after the sun had set and the heat had broken. Which brings us to the next challenge, the climate. If you've ever spent time in the Mediterranean during summer, you know it can be brutal. Now imagine that without air conditioning, ice, or breathable clothing. Most homes were made of mud brick with small windows and no insulation. You couldn't escape the sun. You lived inside it. That beautiful white marble we associate with Greece. In most homes, it was sun-baked dirt, rough stone, and soot from the hearth. Now imagine being a woman. Your life was even more restricted. You weren't allowed to vote, own property in most cities, or even leave the house without a male escort, depending on the city-state. In Athens, respectable women were expected to stay inside, literally. Your job was to manage the household, raise children, weave cloth, and pray that your husband didn't bring shame or disaster home from the agora. Marriage wasn't about romance. It was an arrangement often struck when girls were 14 or younger. Your husband might be twice your age or more. He had full control over your life. Divorce, that was his call. You were expected to be loyal, modest, and invisible. Meanwhile, men could attend symposia, lavish drinking parties where ideas and wine flowed freely. You, as a woman, would never be invited unless you were a hetera, a courtesan educated in music and conversation. But even that role came with consequences, often treated more like an ornament than a person. So no, it wasn't all white robes and deep thoughts under olive trees. For most people, especially women, life was claustrophobic, controlled, and carved by duty. Religion, though, offered some relief, or at least some rhythm. The gods were everywhere, not just in temples, but in doorways, kitchens, gardens, and markets. Every act, lighting a fire, planting seeds, boarding a ship, was done with some form of prayer or offering. You might sprinkle wine on the ground to honor Dionysus, leave a handful of grain for Demeter, or whisper a plea to Artemis under a full moon. Temples weren't quiet places of worship. They were bustling centers of sacrifice and celebration. Priests slit the throats of animals, burned offerings, and read omens from the smoke or the entrails. Festivals filled the calendar. Some were civic events with parades and athletic games. Others were wild, ecstatic rituals with music, masks, and madness. And yes, those oracles, real, or at least believed to be. The most famous was the Oracle of Delphi, where priestesses inhaled vapors and delivered cryptic messages supposedly from Apollo. People traveled for days, even weeks, to hear her muttered wisdom and shape their lives around her riddles. You didn't just live in Greece, you lived in the presence of gods. Every cough, every lightning bolt, every failed harvest had a divine explanation. But what about education? If you were a free-born male child in a city like Athens, you might go to school. Not in a building, just to a hired tutor's home or an outdoor space. You'd start with memorization, lots of it. Homer, Hesiod, the plays, the myths. You'd recite entire verses by heart before you learned to read or write them. Then came gymnastics. Physical fitness was considered essential for the mind and body. You'd wrestle, run, and throw discus under the sun, sometimes nude, in a world where strength was spiritual and beauty was a kind of moral currency. If you were lucky and wealthy, you might go on to study rhetoric and philosophy, preparing for a life in public service. But if you weren't born into means, you'd be working by age 10 or 12, apprenticing in a trade, herding goats, fishing, or helping with the olive harvest. And if you were a girl, there was no school. Your education happened at home. How to spin wool, bake bread, tend to the hearth, and keep quiet. You learned the names of gods, not because you'd ever become a priestess, but so you could teach your children the same prayers. Yet in this world, creativity still bloomed. Theater was a major part of Greek life, not entertainment but ritual. Plays were written to honor the gods, particularly Dionysus. Citizens gathered in huge stone amphitheaters carved into hillsides, watching tragedies unfold beneath the open sky. And these weren't just stories, they were mirrors, reflections on war, pride, betrayal, love, and death. Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus. They poured philosophy into drama, forcing entire cities to sit with their fears, their flaws, their fates. Imagine being a farmer who's just lost a child, sitting beside a merchant who just returned from war, both watching Medea or Antigone for the first time. Everyone crying, everyone reckoning with their own hearts. The plays weren't escapism, they were confrontation, catharsis. Even art and sculpture carried this duality. The statues were idealized, yes, but they showed strain, veins, muscles in motion, faces twisted in effort or ecstasy. This wasn't about perfection. It was about tension, the pull between heaven and flesh, the divine and the human. That's what the Greeks mastered, not comfort, not ease, but contradiction. And they lived in that contradiction every single day. They believed in democracy, but allowed slavery. They valued wisdom, but silenced dissent. They honored beauty, but buried it in suffering. They reached for the stars, while standing barefoot in the dirt. And somehow, from all that mess, they carved ideas that would ripple across time. We'll explore how those ripples reached Rome, the Renaissance, and even our world today in the next part. In ancient Greece, love wasn't just a feeling. It was fate. It was divine. It was dangerous. And no one captured this better than a woman whose voice, though nearly lost to time, still echoes today. Sappho of Lesbos. She didn't write about gods conquering monsters or heroes chasing glory. She wrote about glances, about aching hands and trembling voices, about love, not from a throne, but from the floor of the human heart. Imagine a small room lit by oil lamps. A circle of women sit weaving, singing, laughing. One of them, Sappho, is composing verses, not to entertain kings or please priests, but to remember the scent of someone's hair or the shape of their silence when they walked away. Her poems weren't declarations. They were confessions, and they were radical. In a world where women were often silenced, Sappho spoke. Clearly, personally, erotically. She named names. She didn't reduce her lovers to metaphors. She described them with painful clarity. Their laughter, their perfume, the way their absence made her ache. This wasn't allowed, not because she loved women, but because she dared to say it out loud. Because she dared to speak desire as a woman to other women without apology or permission. In a culture where men dominated literature, politics, and public life, Sappho carved a space entirely her own. She didn't ask to be heard. She created a universe where her voice was the sky. And in that universe, love wasn't weakness. It was worship. She wrote in a dialect called Aeolic Greek, soft, rhythmic, like the sound of a tide pulling back. Her poems followed a specific beat. 3 long lines followed by a short one, like a sigh at the end of longing. That pattern, now called the Sapphic stanza, wasn't just poetic structure. It was emotional rhythm. The rise and fall of breath between two people who almost touch. And yet, most of her work is gone. Why? Time, fire, fear. Her poetry was once collected into 9 full books. Scholars studied her. Playwrights quoted her. Philosophers praised her. Plato even called her the 10th muse. But history doesn't treat honesty kindly. As Christianity rose, Sappho's open expression of female love was labeled immoral. Her books were neglected, then destroyed. What survives today are fragments, shards of longing pulled from ancient trash heaps or scribbled in the margins of grammar books. A phrase here, a half verse there. Still, even these broken pieces breathe. One fragment says, "He is equal to the gods, that man who sits beside you, who listens to your voice." It's a poem of jealousy, not fiery but aching. She watches the woman she loves laugh with someone else. She doesn't rage. She simply breaks beautifully. That's what makes her eternal, not scandal, not fame, vulnerability. She reminds us that love doesn't need full sentences to feel real. A glance can carry a storm. A name whispered once can echo for centuries. Even the words lesbian and sapphic come from her, not because she tried to make them immortal, but because the world recognized something timeless in her voice. But not all Greeks saw love the way Sappho did. For many, love was a battlefield of the soul. In Athens, male relationships were often romanticized in the context of mentorship, an older man guiding a younger one, with intimacy often woven into that bond. Meanwhile, marriages between men and women were practical, transactional. The idea of romantic love as the foundation of marriage, that didn't really exist. Desire was separate from duty. Sex was not necessarily private or sentimental. It was, at times, political. In fact, power dynamics saturated love. Who had control, who pursued, who submitted. Consent, as we understand it today, wasn't always part of the equation. And that's another reason you probably wouldn't last a day in ancient Greece. The emotional landscape was a labyrinth. There were no maps for healthy intimacy, no therapists, no safe spaces to process shame or heartbreak. You had to carry it all, your desire, your loneliness, your fear of dishonor, in silence. Unless, of course, you had poetry. Because that was the one escape valve. Whether you were a soldier remembering a lost friend, a widow mourning a husband, or a girl weaving her longing into linen, poetry gave shape to what the world refused to name. And speaking of soldiers, let's talk about war. You couldn't really avoid it, especially if you were a man of fighting age. From the Peloponnesian Wars to skirmishes between neighboring city-states, conflict was constant, and battle wasn't glorious. It was up close and brutal. Greek warfare wasn't about long-range arrows or clever sieges. It was about standing shoulder to shoulder in a phalanx, your shield covering the man beside you, marching forward as a wall of flesh and bronze. You'd hear the enemy breathing before you ever swung your sword. Death wasn't noble. It was muddy, chaotic, and fast. There were no medics, no evacuation helicopters. If you fell, your best hope was that someone dragged your body out of the dust before it was stripped for parts. And if you survived, PTSD wasn't a concept. You were expected to come home, shut up, and go back to farming. Honor was everything, but it came at a cost. Boys were raised to see death as preferable to cowardice. A man who avoided battle was shamed, excluded, even banned from public speaking. It was a world where silence could be louder than screams. But through all of this, heartbreak, war, hunger, heat, there was one constant: legacy. The Greeks believed in kleos, the glory that outlives you. Your life might be short, but your name, that could echo forever. That's why they built temples, why they carved stories into stone, why they raced, wrote, sculpted, and spoke with passion. Because they knew that time would erase most things. But maybe, just maybe, a few words would survive. And they were right. We still speak their names. Homer, Plato, Sappho, Pericles. We still quote their plays, still debate their philosophies, still marvel at their ruins. But the truth, the ones whose names survived were the exception. Most Greeks, farmers, mothers, fishermen, slaves, left no record. Their days were full of labor, laughter, grief, and prayer. And then they vanished. Which makes the few voices we do have, especially those like Sappho's, even more precious. They're not just relics, they're reminders. That love once sounded like this. That grief once felt like that. That even 2,500 years ago, someone stood beneath the same stars, whispered a name into the night, and hoped to be remembered. That's where we'll pause for now. If you woke up in ancient Athens with a pounding headache, swollen joints, or blood in your cough, don't expect a trip to the local clinic, because that didn't exist. Hospitals weren't a thing yet. You wouldn't find a waiting room or a sterile table or a doctor in a white coat. Instead, you had two options. Option 1, consult the gods. Option 2, consult someone who thought they were one. Let's talk about the first option, the gods. In ancient Greece, illness wasn't seen as something purely physical. It was spiritual. It meant you had upset a deity or violated a sacred order, knowingly or not. So healing wasn't just about fixing the body. It was about restoring cosmic balance. This is where Asclepius comes in, the god of medicine. Temples to Asclepius were scattered across the Greek world, the most famous being at Epidaurus. But don't imagine a peaceful spa. These were part temple, part hospital, part theater. People came from far and wide to sleep in these sacred sanctuaries and hope for a cure. Literally. The process was called incubation. You'd fast, pray, sometimes make sacrifices. Then you'd sleep overnight on the temple floor, hoping the god would visit you in a dream and whisper the cure. Some said he appeared as a bearded man. Others claimed he came as a snake, curling beside their body and licking their wounds. And if you were lucky, you'd wake up healed, or at least inspired. But what if Asclepius didn't show? Well, then you turn to the other option, the physician. The most famous one, of course, was Hippocrates, the guy we credit as the father of medicine. He's the reason we have the Hippocratic Oath, though he probably didn't write it himself. Still, he and his followers were onto something revolutionary. That illness might have natural causes. Sounds obvious now, right? But back then, it was radical. They believed the body was made of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Good health meant keeping these in balance. Bad health, one or more was out of whack. You had too much phlegm, expect a cold. Too much black bile, you'd be moody or melancholic. Treatments weren't exactly scientific, though. They involved diet, herbs, exercise, and more disturbingly, bloodletting, purging, or vomiting. Yes, vomiting. A doctor might tell you to drink wine mixed with seawater, or induce diarrhea with a potion of boiled roots, or prescribe leeches to rebalance your blood. And let's be honest, you weren't always seeing the best of the best. There were no medical licenses. Anyone could call themselves a healer. Some were skilled. Others were charlatans peddling crushed beetles and powdered sheep horn as miracle cures. Even if you found a good one, the tools were primitive. Imagine dull bronze scalpels, no anesthesia, no antibiotics. If you had a deep wound or broken bone, you'd either survive by sheer will or you wouldn't. And childbirth, a terrifying lottery. There were midwives, yes, and many were wise and skilled. But complications meant danger. No C-sections. No epidurals. If the baby was stuck or the mother hemorrhaged, the outcome was often fatal. Death was close. Always. So people turned to amulets, to prayers, to home remedies passed down in whispers and guesswork. They boiled herbs, hung garlic, wore talismans carved with strange symbols. They believed in the evil eye, in curses, in divine punishment hiding in every fever. But here's the twist. Sometimes it worked. Not because the cure was right, but because belief itself can be powerful. The body responds to hope, to ritual, to care. Even a temple floor can feel like healing when you're desperate. And that's the thing, health in ancient Greece wasn't just physical. It was moral, social, divine. If you got sick, people didn't just ask, "What happened to you?" They asked, "What did you do wrong?" That guilt could haunt you more than the illness. And speaking of guilt, let's look at crime and punishment. Say you steal from a neighbor or cheat in the marketplace. What happens? There were no police in the modern sense. Law enforcement was a patchwork of citizen volunteers, guards, and magistrates. If you were rich and well-connected, you could probably talk your way out of anything. If you were poor or enslaved, justice came fast and harsh. Minor crimes might mean public shaming, a fine, a beating. More serious offenses, exile, loss of citizenship, even death. But it's the courtroom system that really gets wild. Athens had a direct democracy, remember, which meant regular citizens, any free male over 30, could serve as jurors. Sometimes there were hundreds on a single panel. Imagine trying to argue your innocence in front of 500 men shouting over each other. And there were no lawyers. You represented yourself. You gave a speech, hoping your words swayed the crowd. If you didn't have the charm of a trained orator, good luck. Oh, and trials were timed with water clocks. If the water ran out before your argument did, too bad. You lost. Punishments varied by class. A wealthy citizen might pay a fine for a crime that got a poor man whipped. Enslaved people could be tortured for information. Women had limited legal standing, and children were often considered property. Justice, like medicine, was a mix of logic and superstition. You could swear an oath before the gods to prove your honesty. You could be cursed in secret by your accuser. And the line between truth and theater was razor thin. Trials were a performance. Win the audience or lose your freedom. But somehow, through all the illness and injustice, people kept going. Because they had something else to cling to. Myth. Myths weren't just bedtime stories. They were maps for living, guides for how to behave, warnings for what happens when you don't. You knew what happened to Icarus if you flew too high. You knew the wrath of Hera if you betrayed your marriage. You saw what the gods did to those who lied, stole, or bragged too much. And maybe, just maybe, those stories made it easier to survive a world that often made no sense. Because when your crops failed, or your baby died, or you got sick and no one knew why, it helped to think there was a reason. A story. A pattern. a God somewhere watching it all unfold. Even if you wouldn't last a day in their world, they wouldn't last a day in ours either. So, let's say you do survive birth in ancient Greece. Congratulations! That alone puts you in rare company. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, and many newborns didn't live past their first year. But you made it. Your first cries echo off sun-baked walls. You're swaddled tight in wool or linen. But don't get too comfortable. Life isn't about to get easier. First off, your survival is still uncertain. Within a few days of being born, your parents, usually the father, have a crucial decision to make. Not about your name. About whether to keep you. Yes, really. In ancient Greece, newborns weren't automatically welcomed into the family. The baby was placed on the ground. If the father picked it up, that was his way of saying this one lives. If he did, the infant could be exposed, left outside on a hillside or at the edge of the city, abandoned to the elements, animals, or strangers. Why? Maybe the child was sickly. Maybe the family was too poor. Maybe the baby was born female, because daughters were often seen as a burden unless a dowry could be promised. It was cruel but common. Exposure wasn't always a death sentence. Sometimes infants were taken in by others, raised as slaves or adopted. But the message was clear. Your life had to be justified from day one. If you were accepted, life as a child in ancient Greece was no playground. Let's start with food. Babies were breastfed if the mother was healthy enough, or if the family could afford a wet nurse. Weaning happened early, and toddlers were introduced to a bland diet. Barley mash, goat's milk, bits of fruit if available. Sweet snacks. Nope. Kid-friendly meals, not a thing. You weren't wrapped in soft cotton pajamas. You wore simple tunics, often hand-me-downs, sometimes just a belt around your waist in warm weather. You were barefoot most of the time. Toys existed, a doll made of clay, a ball stuffed with rags. But play came second to chores, especially if you were poor. And forget modern ideas of childhood innocence. In ancient Greece, childhood was a trial, a long apprenticeship toward becoming useful. By age 5 or 6, your duties started. Boys helped with farming, animal care, or apprentice work. Girls learned to spin, weave, cook, and care for siblings. You didn't get a gold star for effort. You got yelled at for slacking. Education. That depended on your gender and your class. If you were a boy in a wealthy household in Athens, you might go to school. Not a big public building with desks and lockers, more like a private tutor or a small group of kids learning in a courtyard. Your subjects: reading, writing, arithmetic, music, and this being Greece, gymnastics and rhetoric. You decopy down verses of Homer on a wax tablet, memorize speeches, and try not to mess up your penmanship while sitting cross-legged on the ground. But if you were a girl, you stayed home. Full stop. Girls weren't educated formally. You learned from your mother or other women in the house. You were trained in the domestic arts, spinning wool, managing food, being obedient, preparing to marry young. You could be betrothed by age 12, married by 14. And here's the brutal truth. Your value wasn't based on how clever or kind you were. It was tied to your purity, your dowry, and your ability to bear children. You didn't belong to yourself. First, to your father. Then to your husband. Now for the boys, especially in Sparta, your journey took a different, much harsher path. At age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their homes and placed in the agoge, a brutal state-run military training program. There were no bedtime stories, no warm dinners, no hugs from mom. Instead, you learned to fight, steal, endure pain, and never complain. You were beaten if caught stealing, but also beaten if you didn't steal because it meant you weren't trying hard enough to survive. You slept on reeds, walked barefoot, ate meager rations. You were trained to be silent, obedient, deadly. Love and affection replaced with discipline and scars. By 12 or 13, your body was already expected to be strong, tough, able to defend your city-state, your honor, your ancestors. Puberty didn't come with awkward health class conversations. It came with expectations to fight, to lead, to someday die gloriously in battle if needed. Imagine being 14 and already expected to be a warrior. Imagine carrying a shield that weighed half your body and marching under a sun that showed no mercy. This was the rhythm of life. Childhood blurred into adulthood fast, especially for boys. No sweet 16, no slow transitions. You were either preparing to be useful or you were a liability. And through it all, your honor was everything. Say the wrong thing and your name could be ruined. Show weakness in public. You could be mocked or worse, ostracized. Reputation mattered more than comfort. Legacy more than laughter. What about emotions? Cry too much, you're weak. Laugh too loudly, undignified. The emotional lives of ancient Greek boys were often hidden behind layers of pride, silence, and performance. For girls, emotions were tightly monitored, suppressed, or treated as dangerous. Yet despite all this, children did find ways to be children. They played with pets, puppies, goats, even monkeys if rich. They created little toys out of scraps. They raced, splashed in streams, made up songs. They mimicked grown-ups, sometimes hilariously. And in festivals, those rare public holidays, you could see kids dancing in procession, wearing garlands, clutching their parents' robes. For a moment, the grind paused. For a moment, they belonged. But that moment never lasted long, because ancient Greece didn't wait for you to grow up. It demanded that you become useful as soon as you could walk. And when you did, you stepped into a society defined by competition. Competition wasn't just about sports or war. It was how you proved your worth in nearly everything. Who spoke best? Who reasoned best? Who had the strongest body, the cleverest mind, the most obedient children? This obsession with status shaped careers, marriages, politics, even philosophy. But we'll dive into that next. So, you've survived the brutal beginnings. You weren't left on a hillside. You weren't swept away by disease or dismissed by your city. You've learned to speak, walk, work, and hide your tears. Now what? Welcome to adulthood in ancient Greece, where everything is a performance. In today's world, we sometimes talk about putting on a face for social media or showing our best selves online. In ancient Greece, that idea wasn't digital, it was cultural. Your entire existence was a public presentation. Your voice, your body, your home, your handshake, it all had to send the right message. Respectable, strong, disciplined, noble, male or female, rich or poor, You were expected to perform your place in society with perfect choreography. Let's start with the men. If you were a man in Athens, your adulthood came with a heavy load, both figuratively and literally. You weren't just responsible for your household. You were expected to participate in civic life. And by participate, we mean everything from attending long political assemblies to voting on laws to defending your city with a spear in your hand. Democracy wasn't a right. It was a duty, and not an optional one. But that democracy had limits. Only free adult males with Athenian-born parents could vote. That excluded women, slaves, medics, resident foreigners, and sometimes even poor men. So yeah, it wasn't exactly all-inclusive. Still, if you were in the club, the pressure was enormous. You had to stay informed on debates, philosophy, war, taxes, alliances, and more. Imagine going from working in your vineyard all morning to debating military strategy with philosophers that afternoon, and ending your day defending your right to speak in front of a crowd of 500 angry men at the Phoenix Hill. No microphones, just your lungs and your reputation. And oh, reputation, that was everything. One wrong move, one foolish argument, one drunken outburst, one badly phrased speech, and your public image could crumble overnight. There was no PR team to clean it up, just whispers in the agora and judgment in the eyes of your peers. Honor for men was public currency. Lose it and you lost more than status. You lost power. You lost protection. You could even be ostracized, banished from the city for 10 years by popular vote. No trial, no appeal, just a broken name and a long walk into exile. And remember, this was the same society that elevated thinkers like Socrates, and then made him drink hemlock for being too dangerous to the moral order. Now let's talk about the body. In ancient Greece, physical perfection wasn't a luxury, it was an ideal, a moral one. A strong, balanced, beautiful body meant discipline, virtue, self-control. Male nudity wasn't taboo, it was celebrated in gymnasiums, on vases, in sculpture. The human form, sculpted by sweat and marble, was seen as divine. You were expected to train your body like you trained your mind. Athletics were central to manhood. Running, wrestling, discus, javelin, pancration. A brutal no-holds-barred mix of boxing and wrestling. This wasn't just for sport. It was about proving you deserved your role in society. But if you were too obsessed with your looks, that was vanity. Too soft, that was weakness. Too aggressive, that was vulgar. Balance was key. Moderation in all things, even in excellence. And don't think women were spared from performance either. For women, adulthood meant marriage, not love. Not romance. Marriage. You were likely betrothed in your early teens to a man much older. Someone chosen by your father, not because he made you laugh or respected your soul, but because he had land, sheep, and a decent social standing. You moved into his home. You ran the household. You bore children, hopefully sons. Your honor wasn't public, it was private, measured by how well you stayed out of sight. A good woman was one who spoke little, dressed modestly, stayed loyal, and didn't embarrass her husband by being too clever or too curious. And if you failed, there were no second chances. You could be divorced, disowned, or locked away, literally. Some Athenian homes kept women in upper rooms or behind screens out of view from guests. You weren't supposed to attend banquets, speak in court, or be seen at the marketplace. Even your voice could be considered too forward. That said, not all women conform to this mold. In places like Sparta, women had more freedom. They exercised, owned property, even gave bold opinions. But the trade-off, they were expected to raise warriors, toughen their sons, mock their husbands if they came home without victory. Come back with your shield or on it, they'd say. Tenderness was not encouraged. Strength was the currency. Now let's zoom out and talk about legacy. Why did the Greeks care so much about image, body, discipline, status? Because they believed in kleos, glory. The kind that echoed after death. To die with honor, to be remembered. To have your name carved into stone, sung in poetry, or whispered over wine generations later. That was the dream. Not comfort, not wealth, but meaning. You were supposed to do something worth remembering, which brings us to the artists, the philosophers, the poets. They weren't exempt from these pressures, they just faced them differently. To be a playwright like Euripides or Sophocles was to walk a cultural tightrope. You had to entertain, enlighten, and provoke, without crossing lines that would get you punished. Theater was sacred in Greece. Funded by the city, performed in outdoor amphitheaters that held thousands. You wrote tragedies about fate, comedies about politics, and wove philosophy into art. But you could still get fined, or worse, if your message was too disruptive. To be a philosopher like Socrates or Diogenes was to live under constant scrutiny. You could challenge ideas but not customs. Question gods but not worship. You could provoke people to think, but too much thinking. That made you dangerous. Just ask Socrates, who was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, because he dared to ask questions that made people uncomfortable. And if you were a woman artist like the poet Sappho, you weren't just challenging norms, you were rewriting them. Sappho's verses, written in the first person, spoke of female longing, tenderness, jealousy, joy. She wrote to women, for women, about women, in a world that didn't believe a woman's voice belonged in literature. Her fragments survive not because she was universally embraced, but because her brilliance refused to disappear. Even centuries of censorship couldn't kill her truth. And that truth, it complicates the clean-cut version of ancient Greek greatness we like to celebrate. Yes, they built columns. Yes, they gave us democracy, theater, logic, and poetry. But beneath the marble lies a society of constant pressure, of limits, of brutal expectations on men, on women, on children. Ancient Greece was beautiful, but it was not easy. It was a place where your life belonged to the city, where freedom existed for a few and perfection was demanded from everyone, where love could be dangerous and truth could get you killed. And that's why most of us wouldn't last a single day. By now, you've realized that life in ancient Greece wasn't exactly a sun-drenched vacation in a toga. It was hard, demanding, public, but it was also noisy, vivid, unfiltered. Because as rigid as Greek society was, it was also bursting with color, especially in the streets. Let's talk agora. The agora was the social and commercial hub of every Greek city. Not just a marketplace, it was the place. Imagine a dusty square packed with vendors, philosophers, hustlers, gossiping women, wandering dogs, barefoot children, and maybe a goat or two causing chaos. The air smelled like a mix of roasted fish, ripe olives, sweat, and clay. Everyone shouting at once, prices being haggled, accusations of cheating flying louder than the crows overhead. This was where deals were made, both economic and political. Want fish? Haggle for it. Need cloth? Hope it's not moth-eaten. Looking for a husband? Don't speak. Just make eye contact from a distance and hope the matchmaker does the rest. And then, woven between all this chaos, came the thinkers. You might walk past a skinny old man arguing with teenagers beneath an olive tree, only to find out later that was Socrates. His classroom was the dirt beneath his sandals, his blackboard the minds of anyone who stopped to listen. He asked questions, always questions, never answers, and he'd rattle you, not with shouting but with unsettling clarity. He might ask, "What is justice?" And 10 minutes later you'd be questioning your entire upbringing. And then he'd walk away. No applause, just silence and confusion in his wake. But the streets weren't all logic and philosophy. They were also rhythm, song, festival. The Greeks didn't believe in living quietly. Their gods demanded drama, and they delivered. Take the Dionysia, a wild multi-day festival honoring Dionysus, god of wine, madness, and theater. Streets filled with processions, choruses in costume, and sacred rituals that somehow blended spiritual reverence with absolute chaos. People got drunk, but not just for fun. It was sacred intoxication, a way to reach the divine. Even the stiffest philosopher might let loose during Dionysia, because during these festivals, the rules of everyday life bent. Hierarchies blurred, boundaries dissolved. Or look at the Panathenaic Games, Athens, version of the Olympics. Foot races, discus throws, chariot races, and musical competitions, all tied to honoring the goddess Athena. Winners weren't just applauded, they were heroes. Crowned with olive wreaths and often gifted amphorae full of sacred olive oil. And these weren't just athletes. They were walking symbols of ideal Greek manhood. Fast, strong, graceful, and publicly admired. Yet even the festivals had rules. If you were a woman in Athens, you weren't allowed to perform in or even attend many of these events. Some were open only to citizens. Others had religious restrictions. But women had their own festivals, too, private, powerful rituals like the Thesmophoria, where wives, mothers, and widows gathered to honor Demeter, the goddess of grain and fertility. Men weren't allowed. What happened during the 3-day celebration? We don't really know, and maybe that was the point. Greek religion wasn't just about belief, it was about presence. Every city had its patron deity. Every home had a shrine. Every action, planting crops, building ships, getting married, was laced with ritual. If you sneezed, that could be a divine sign. If your olive oil spilled, bad omen. If your neighbor sacrificed a goat and forgot the incense, disaster might strike the whole street. But the gods, they were flawed. They got jealous, drunk, petty, vindictive. They punished mortals for hubris, infidelity, laziness, even for being too beautiful. Worshipping them wasn't just about praise. It was about appeasement. You didn't trust the gods. You respected them like cosmic mob bosses. You prayed they wouldn't notice you, unless, of course, you needed something. That tension between faith and fear was everywhere. Offerings were made with trembling hands. Oracles were consulted before battles. Farmers poured wine on the soil hoping for rain. Sailors whispered prayers into the waves, begging Poseidon for safe passage. Even the sick made pilgrimages to healing temples of Asclepius, hoping a snake would slither over their bed and bring visions of a cure. This mix of the sacred and the chaotic shaped every corner of Greek life. Your calendar wasn't marked by vacations or work trips. It was filled with feast days, mourning rituals, and processions. Religion wasn't an escape from life. It was life. And don't get the wrong idea, Greeks weren't always solemn. They laughed. They danced. They mocked each other in dirty comedies and absurd plays filled with slapstick and political jabs. Aristophanes' works. Imagine Saturday Night Live mixed with Shakespeare and a touch of frat house humor. No topic was off limits. Sex, war, religion, politicians, even the gods got roasted. Humor was a pressure valve, a way to poke fun at power, to survive the weight of a world that demanded so much from you. Because beneath the marble, beneath the discipline, beneath the rituals, ancient Greece was human, messy, brilliant, hypocritical, inspired, and that humanity, it didn't whisper. It shouted. So if you were suddenly dropped into ancient Athens at high noon during market day, your senses would short-circuit. The smells, the noise, the heat, the expectations, the endless demand to perform, you wouldn't last an hour. Not because you're soft, but because it was a society built on unrelenting pressure, spiritual anxiety, and social exposure. You'd miss privacy. You'd miss choice. You'd miss a moment to just be. You'd think that once you left the agora, stepping away from the crowds, the goats, and the grumpy philosophers, you'd finally catch a break. Maybe rest your feet. Maybe breathe. Maybe find a sliver of peace, but not quite. Behind the walls of an ancient Greek home was a different kind of pressure. A quiet one. No crowds watching, no marketplace drama, just roles, expectations, the slow churn of family, reputation, and survival. You didn't escape the demands of Greek society by going home. You just traded one set of rules for another. Let's step inside. Homes varied wildly depending on wealth. A wealthy Athenian might live in a multi-room structure with a small courtyard, designated rooms for guests, and even indoor plumbing if they were very lucky. But for most, you got a modest space, mud brick or stone, a dirt floor, tiny windows, and a shared sleeping area that doubled as a kitchen, workspace, and, well, everything. There was no such thing as me time. Your kids, your spouse, maybe your aging parents, all sleeping, eating, and working in the same cramped space. Privacy, a fantasy. Your personal business was the family's business, and the family's business was everyone else's business. Now, if you were a man, your daily life revolved around public duties. Working, voting, debating, attending festivals. But if you were a woman, your world was mostly confined to this home. You cooked, cleaned, wove cloth, raised children, and kept the household gods happy. Your virtue was your family's honor, and the walls of your house weren't just physical, They were moral. There was even a word for this separation: gynoecium. It was the inner women's quarters. Visitors, especially men, were not allowed. Your voice, your body, your thoughts, they were to remain inside. Seen as sacred, yes, but also silent. Now imagine being a teenage girl knowing your future was mostly planned out. Marriage, often by 15, likely to a man much older than you. Your dowry negotiated behind closed doors. No dating, no say. Your body was currency, your womb a vessel for sons, and that was considered normal, even ideal. Love, affection, optional. Many of these marriages were arranged for status, alliances, or economic reasons. Some turned out loving. Others didn't. There were no counseling sessions, no finding yourself in your 20s. You became a wife, then a mother, then, if you were lucky, an old woman who'd earned the right to speak more freely. And the domestic workload never stopped. Laundry meant hauling water from a fountain, scrubbing garments against stones, drying them under a punishing sun, and praying the dust didn't undo your effort before sundown. Cooking meant grinding barley by hand, stoking a clay hearth and balancing pots over uneven flames. A burnt loaf wasn't just dinner ruined, it could mean hunger for the family. And illness, that was terrifying. There were no antibiotics, no urgent care, no safety nets. You used herbs, hope, and maybe the advice of an old neighbor who claimed to have learned something from her grandmother's goat. If a child spiked a fever, you prayed. Maybe to Apollo, maybe to Asclepius, maybe to the kitchen fire itself, just in case the gods were listening. But in all this hardship, women also carved out pockets of strength. They gathered at wells, shared stories, passed down remedies and advice. They hosted rituals, taught daughters how to survive, and when no one was watching, sometimes told jokes that would make Aristophanes blush. The feminine space of the home, while restricted, was also powerful, a place of memory, magic, and resilience. Meanwhile, boys had a very different track. By age 7, they were already being shaped into citizens. Taught reading, writing, math, sure, but also how to speak well, argue, command respect. Rhetoric was a weapon, and Athens sharpened its sons like knives. Physical training came early too. Gymnasiums weren't just for fitness. They were social institutions, places where bodies were perfected, philosophies debated, and alliances formed. And the gymnasium wasn't what we think of today. It literally means place of nakedness. Boys trained nude, wrestling, running, discussing politics. It was equal parts discipline and display. For outsiders today, it sounds bizarre. For Greeks, it was foundational. By adulthood, a young man was expected to be eloquent, informed, athletic, and ready to defend the city if needed. He was a citizen, and that meant duty. But that status came with limitations. Not everyone in Greece could be a citizen. Women couldn't. Slaves certainly couldn't. Foreigners, no matter how long they'd lived in the city, were barred from voting, owning land, or participating in politics. Your entire legal and social worth hinged on your birth. And that brings us to slavery. Yes, the birthplace of democracy also relied heavily on human bondage. Slaves were everywhere, in homes, in fields, in silver mines, in shipyards. Some were captured in war. Others were born into slavery. Some were educated scribes, others were laborers worked to the bone. They had no rights, no legal standing, no family protections. A bad day could mean a beating or worse. And yet the Greeks saw this as normal, even necessary. Philosophers like Aristotle argued that some people were naturally slaves. Imagine hearing that from your master after he spent the morning debating virtue in the agora. It was hypocrisy baked into the system, a society that praised reason and justice, but only for a select few. So even inside the home, surrounded by familiar walls, life in ancient Greece wasn't safe. It was structured, controlled. Every relationship, parent to child, husband to wife, master to servant, was a hierarchy. The home was a microcosm of the state, and the weight of it pressed down on everyone in different ways. You wouldn't last long in that pressure cooker, not because you're weak, but because modern life has taught you to expect freedom, privacy, and fairness. And ancient Greece, it offered none of those without a cost. As dusk begins to roll in, the sharp angles of stone walls soften. Shadows stretch longer across the floor. The heat that once scorched the courtyard finally begins to loosen its grip, and for a brief moment, just a sliver, the ancient Greek world exhales. But don't mistake twilight for rest. There's still much to do before the darkness settles fully. Evening rituals in ancient Greece weren't just about winding down. They were about rebalancing, appeasing the household gods, honoring the ancestors, making sense of the chaos of the day with a bit of fire, food, and myth. In the corner of your home, likely near the hearth, you'd find the family shrine, a small altar to Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home. Maybe there's a worn clay statue, or a dish holding the remains of a burnt offering, charred herbs, a few drops of wine, some olive oil. Every evening someone, usually the eldest woman or head of the house, would tend to that fire, feed it, whisper a prayer, ask for safety, health, or maybe just peace. Dinner came next, and no, it wasn't a feast. Not unless it was a festival day or your family had unexpected good fortune. Most nights, it was leftovers of maza, barley bread reheated over embers, a few olives, a handful of legumes, maybe some boiled greens if the garden had produced something usable. But dinner was more than food. It was theater. If you were in a wealthier home, men reclined on couches around a low table, eating while propped on one elbow, wine diluted with water in ceramic craters beside them. If there were guests, the host would pour the wine, say a toast, and maybe even recite a poem. For many Greeks, the night was when stories unfolded, not just of gods and heroes, but of real people, shared lessons, and family wisdom. In humbler homes, you sat cross-legged on the dirt floor. The same pot that cooked dinner all day now sat in the middle of the group. No silverware. You used your fingers or scooped with bits of bread. And while you ate, someone, often an elder, might begin a tale. Not from a book, not from a scroll, from memory. My grandfather, they'd say, once saw a god walk through the olive grove. And just like that, the fire crackled a little louder. Children leaned in closer. The ordinary walls of your crumbling home became the stage for epic stories. This was how history lived, through mouths and ears, passed from generation to generation. You didn't just learn mythology. You breathed it. Heroes like Odysseus weren't abstract. They were relatives, ancestors, warnings, and aspirations. When you heard their adventures, you imagined your own courage tested on stormy seas, even if the furthest you ever traveled was the marketplace. After dinner, the lamp was trimmed, a small clay dish with a wick soaked in olive oil. Its glow was weak but warm. It flickered on cracked plaster walls, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. You didn't have candles. You didn't have torches. You had this faint, golden flicker and your imagination to fill in the dark corners. And what lurked in those corners? Plenty. Night in ancient Greece wasn't just dark, it was spiritual, dangerous, alive. It's when ghosts wandered, when dreams could be omens, and when gods whispered through the rustle of leaves or the moan of the wind. Superstition ran deep. If you left a door unlatched, it wasn't just a breeze that might slip in. It could be a wandering spirit. If someone in the family had died recently, coins were placed on their eyes before burial, not only for Karen, the ferryman of the underworld, but to keep their spirit from wandering home and disturbing the living. So you made sure the hearth was fed, the offerings given, and the doors bolted, just in case. When it was time to sleep, you didn't retire to a cozy bed. There was no plush mattress, no memory foam, no weighted blanket. You laid on a straw mat or a thin pad rolled out on the floor. Maybe, if you were fortunate, a wooden bed frame with rope lashings. The same cloak that kept you warm in the day was now your blanket, your arm, your pillow. And you didn't sleep alone unless you were sick or a slave. The whole family often shared one room, bodies curled beside one another for warmth. Babies nested near their mothers. The elderly nestled close to the fire pit's remains, seeking comfort for their aching joints. Snores mixed with whispers. The night breathed with you. But even then, rest wasn't guaranteed. Mosquitoes buzzed. Lice tickled your scalp. The wind howled through the wooden shutters. You might wake in the night from a nightmare, or from the echo of your neighbor screaming at a god in his sleep. Dreams were not just dreams. They were seen as messages from the divine. Some you welcomed, others you feared. You might wake with a start, heart racing, then reach for the lamp to relight it, whispering to Hecate, goddess of ghosts and crossroads, hoping her realm hadn't crept into yours. And if you did manage a few hours of rest before the roosters called again, you'd wake stiff, still tired, the clay dust clinging to your skin, the air already warming from the rising sun. Another day, another repetition, another round of survival. Because in ancient Greece, rest wasn't a reward, it was a pause. And every new morning demanded everything from you once again. Your strength, your voice, your prayers, and your ability to live inside a system that wasn't designed to make life easy. You'd think the countryside meant peace, right? Open skies, olive groves stretching into the horizon, goats bleating softly as they graze. Sounds idyllic. But for a farmer in ancient Greece, this wasn't some pastoral postcard. It was backbreaking labor stitched together with superstition and seasonal desperation. The day began before first light, long before. A Greek farmer didn't wait for the rooster to crow. He was already halfway up the hillside by then. With a mattock slung over one shoulder and calloused feet thick as leather, he set out to work the earth, guided not by calendars but by the stars and the tilt of the seasons. And the land, it didn't make things easy. Greek soil was stubborn, rocky, thin. If you wanted a good harvest, you didn't just need rain and sun. You needed luck, prayer, and the patience of a saint. You might get barley, lentils, grapes if you were lucky. Wheat was a luxury. Olive trees took decades to grow but were the backbone of economy and trade. Still, even a modest grove took constant care, pruning, watering, guarding against rot and storms. Oh, and then there were the goats. They were loud, stubborn, hungry, but their milk made cheese, their wool spun into thread, and their droppings, well, fertilizer. Shepherding wasn't a job for the weak. It meant long days chasing your flock across hillsides and sleeping under stars with a dagger tucked beneath your head in case wolves came sniffing. But it wasn't just the animals or the fields that tested you, it was the calendar of the gods. Every season had its rituals, every crop had its patron deity. You didn't just plant, you prayed. Before the first barley was sown, you offered a libation to Demeter, goddess of the harvest. Before the vines blossomed, a small animal might be sacrificed at the altar, usually a piglet or a dove. Not because you were cruel, because the gods were watching and forgetting them could bring ruin. And these weren't quiet, solemn rituals. They were wild. Take the festival of Thesmophoria. Only women participated. Wives, mothers, and maidens of the city would leave their homes and head to the countryside, honoring Demeter with 3 days of sacred rites. No men were allowed. What did they do? No one's totally sure. But what's written suggests fasting, offerings of dead piglets thrown into pits, and possibly even strange symbolic marriages to the earth. It was sacred. It was secret. It was powerful. In fact, many of the most important Greek religious events weren't held inside temples. They happened in the fields, the woods, the hillsides. Because nature wasn't just background, it was alive, sacred. A place where gods might appear at any moment disguised as a breeze, a shadow, a voice in the olive trees. And that meant the countryside was never truly silent. At night, after the tools were put away and the goats tucked in their pens, the farmer might sit with his family outside, chewing olives and watching the stars. But his ears stayed alert. Was that the wind, or the sound of satyrs dancing in the grove? Was that owl a messenger of Athena, or a bad omen? Superstition ruled the dark. If someone fell ill, you didn't immediately go to a doctor, especially out here, where trained physicians were rare. Instead, you might visit a local seer or healer, maybe a woman who knew herbs passed down from her grandmother, maybe a priest who could offer a ritual cleansing, or maybe you take your ailing child to a nearby spring rumored to be sacred, hoping a god would take pity. And if the illness lingered, you prayed harder. For rural Greeks, survival wasn't just about growing food or mending fences. It was about maintaining balance with unseen forces. Every misstep, a poorly timed offering, a broken taboo, could bring misfortune. There was a deep, instinctive connection between the people and the land. They didn't see nature as something to conquer. It was a living system they were part of, with rules older than any law. When a tree died suddenly, they didn't ask what disease. They asked, which god did we offend? This spiritual worldview, extended to even the most mundane tasks. Before baking bread, a woman might sprinkle flour on the hearth in Demeter's honor. Before butchering a goat, the head of the household might say a quiet prayer. Even a cracked pot wasn't just garbage, it might be buried ritually or offered as a votive at a local shrine. Nothing was wasted. Not time, not food, not belief. And speaking of food, rural cuisine in ancient Greece was simple, seasonal, and brutally honest. No spices from India, no sugar. Your meals followed the land. In spring, maybe fresh greens and cheese. In summer, dried figs, fish, barley, cakes. In autumn, roasted chestnuts and wine. Winter, it was rough. Dried beans, old olives, maybe a smoked fish if you were lucky. And wine, ah yes, the nectar of the gods, was drunk daily. But don't imagine stemmed goblets and clinking toasts. You drank it from rough clay cups, always watered down. Only barbarians drank it straight. That was seen as uncivilized. Dangerous. You weren't just drinking to get drunk, you were drinking to connect, to toast the gods, to feel alive. Even children had wine, diluted, of course. Water wasn't always safe. And besides, wine was considered a gift from Dionysus, a god who lived in the wilds, who knew both ecstasy and madness. And let's not forget the darker side of country life. You were always one bad harvest away from hunger, one storm away from ruin, one band of raiders or wandering mercenaries away from tragedy. There were no police, no 911. If your neighbor stole your grain, you had two options. Take him to court in the city, which could take weeks, or confront him yourself, risking a feud that might last generations. Honor meant everything. So did reputation. You didn't just survive with tools. You survived with trust or fear. Children worked young. Girls helped in the kitchen, carried water, fed animals. Boys tilled soil, sharpened blades, herded goats. School, maybe, if the family could afford it and lived close to a town. But most rural kids learned through doing. Watching, listening, messing up and trying again. And through all of this, the dirt, the danger, the devotion, there was a strange kind of beauty. When the fields were golden with wheat, when the breeze carried the scent of time, when a festival lit up the hills with music and laughter, you'd remember. This was home, not perfect, not easy, but yours. And maybe that's the part we often forget when imagining ancient Greece. It wasn't all marble statues and heroic speeches. It was cracked hands, shared bread, sacred silence beneath olive trees, a whispered prayer before sleep. Temples in ancient Greece weren't cozy little chapels where you sat quietly with folded hands. They were powerhouses. Stone giants carved into hillsides or rising out of city centers, flanked by columns that soared like tree trunks. Inside, they didn't hold congregations. They held the gods, or at least that's what everyone believed. But don't get this twisted. Ancient Greek religion wasn't about faith the way we think of it today. It wasn't personal salvation or sin or weekly sermons. It was duty, custom, a lifelong performance of reciprocity. You gave to the gods, they gave back maybe. Forget to offer them wine on the right day. Well, don't be surprised if your crops fail or your child gets a fever. It was a relationship built on fear, respect, and tradition. And the temples, they were their houses, not symbolic homes, real ones. That massive statue of Athena inside the Parthenon, that wasn't art, that was her. You didn't stare up at it thinking, wow, impressive sculpting. You walked in like you were stepping into a royal court, trying not to make a sound, eyes lowered, heartbeat thudding, wondering if she was watching. Because she was, or so they believed. You didn't just visit these places on a whim either. Most of the time, the inner chamber, the naos, was off limits to the general public. Only priests or priestesses could enter. If you were sick or needed help, you brought offerings: bread, wine, coins, a little animal. You might leave a lock of hair, a baby's blanket, or a carved figurine symbolizing what you wanted. Praying for fertility. You left a tiny sculpture of a womb. Praying for healing. A model of your leg or your liver. It was both deeply emotional and shockingly practical. And sacrifices. Oh, they were everywhere. Not always bloody, some were just fruit or incense. But if the stakes were high, you went big. Maybe a goat. Maybe an ox if you were really trying to get the gods' attention. The animal was washed, adorned with garlands, and led to the altar. A priest murmured the ritual words. The crowd stood silent, and then, one swift slice. The blood spilled. The smoke rose, and everyone waited to see if the god would answer. Now, if you're squeamish, ancient Greek worship might seem a bit intense. But to them, it was normal, sacred, life-affirming. Blood wasn't gruesome, it was power. A bridge between mortal and immortal. The smell of burning fat. That was considered delicious to the gods. Every part of the ritual was choreographed, inherited from centuries of tradition. And messing it up, that wasn't just embarrassing. It could doom a harvest, curse a city, or bring shame on your entire family. And believe me, shame mattered. Reputation in Greek society wasn't just about status, it was moral currency. To be seen as pious, honorable, generous, that was how you earned trust. And temples were where that performance played out. You didn't just sacrifice for the gods. You sacrificed so others would see you sacrificing. And when the meat was cooked, it wasn't wasted. It became a communal feast. Yes, sacred barbecue. Imagine hundreds of citizens gathered outside a temple, eating roasted lamb together after a successful offering. It wasn't quiet. It was celebration. Laughter. Music, maybe a little wine flowing too freely. Temples weren't always solemn. They were also places of joy, of community. The divine and the earthly met over fire and food. But not everyone was allowed to participate equally. Women, slaves, foreigners, they had different rules. Some temples banned them altogether. Others allowed them only at specific times for specific rituals. And even among citizens, your role depended on your lineage. Were you from a noble family? You might serve as a priest or sponsor a festival. A farmer. You brought your goat, hoped for the best, and stood at the back. Still, religion wasn't just a top-down affair. It was in everything. Little shrines sat in kitchens and courtyards. You greeted Hermes before a journey. You tossed wine on the ground before drinking. Even before entering your own house, you might nod to Hestia, goddess of the hearth. Life in ancient Greece was wrapped in divine choreography. And festivals. Oh, they were wild. The city Dionysia in Athens was part theater, part ritual, part wine-soaked party. Everyone participated. Even prisoners were released to attend. Plays were performed as offerings to Dionysus, god of wine, madness, and ecstasy. Imagine sitting in a massive amphitheater with 10,000 others, watching a tragedy unfold under the spring sun, knowing it was meant to honor a god. Or the Eleusinian mysteries, secret rites so sacred that even today no one fully knows what happened. We just know this: if you were accepted, you fasted. You drank a special brew. You walked in silence along a sacred road. And then in a torchlit temple at Eleusis, something was revealed. Something so profound that initiates swore never to speak of it, not even under pain of death. Whatever it was, it changed them. And isn't that the point? In ancient Greece, religion wasn't just a part of life, it was the rhythm beneath it. Birth, illness, travel, love, war, death, every chapter of your life had its ritual, its patron god, its sacrifice. You didn't just believe. You lived inside belief. And when things went wrong, it wasn't random. It meant someone had forgotten something, a missed prayer, a dishonored oath. The gods weren't cruel, they were just meticulous. Fair in a way that was terrifying. Fair in a way that left no room for arrogance. You were mortal. You knew your place. And you gave thanks for every sunrise. So if you're wondering why you might not last a day in ancient Greece, here's another reason. You'd be living under constant cosmic pressure. Not just from society, but from Olympus itself. And if you thought your morning commute today was stressful, try doing it while worried Zeus might smite your donkey cart for skipping libation duty last night. So let's say you've just woken up in Athens. But this time, you're not a soldier, not a philosopher, not a merchant. You're a woman, and that changes everything. In public, your voice is muted, your presence managed. The agora, the lively central marketplace, isn't really for you. Temples, only on certain feast days. Voting, speaking in court, owning property outright. Forget it. You're not just excluded from power. You're excluded from the idea of citizenship itself. And yet, your day starts early. Not with scrolls or rhetoric, but with the grind of a handmill, the hiss of hot water, and the weight of daily chores. You fetch water from the communal fountain, maybe in silence, maybe whispering gossip to the woman beside you. You tend to children. You supervise the spinning, the weaving, the food. Your realm is the oikos, the household. And believe it or not, this quiet domestic world is its own kind of empire. Weaving wasn't just busy work, it was identity. Greek women didn't buy their clothes, they made them, with their hands over days and weeks. And that woven fabric, it clothed their families, honored the gods, and even paid tribute in funerals and festivals. The loom was more than a tool, it was a throne of sorts. The rhythm of thread over thread was a heartbeat, a prayer, a statement. I am still here. And here's the thing, they were. Despite being denied the spotlight, women shaped the culture in invisible ways. Think about the myths we've inherited. Penelope, patiently weaving and unweaving while Odysseus wandered. Or the priestesses at Delphi whose vision steered kings. Or even the festivals like Thesmophoria, led entirely by women, honoring Demeter and Persephone, celebrating fertility and female bonds. These weren't just rituals. They were resistance, spaces where women could gather without male oversight. They prayed, they laughed, They wept together, and maybe, just maybe, they remembered that their worth didn't need validation from the assembly or the courts. Their stories passed from mouth to mouth, from mother to daughter, from cradle to grave. Marriage, it wasn't romantic, it was economic. Girls often wed around age 14, sometimes younger, usually to men twice their age. A father arranged it, offering a dowry, calculating alliances, smoothing family politics. A woman's job: bear children, maintain the household, uphold family honor. But in that arrangement, many women found small freedoms: managing estates, guiding sons, whispering truths into their husbands' ears that later shaped decisions. And love. Well, love was complicated. Women were expected to be chaste, quiet, devoted. But human hearts don't always follow rules. Desire, longing, loneliness, they existed behind those closed doors. In letters, in poems, in songs passed like secrets. There's evidence: shards of pottery, faded verses, household shrines, that not all affection followed the scripts written by men. And then there's Sappho, a woman who shattered the silence with song, who dared to write about love, not just any love, but love between women, longing not as tragedy, but as truth. Her voice still echoes today, even though most of her poems were lost, burned, or twisted by centuries of censorship. But what remains, it's fire. She wrote of trembling hands, flushed cheeks, the sound of a lover's laugh. No epic battles, no gods throwing lightning, just the heartbeat of raw emotion. And that was revolutionary. In a world where a woman's gaze was supposed to be lowered, Sappho looked straight into the soul and said, "I see you." She wasn't the only one. Across Greece, in shadows and silences, women were documenting life in their own way. Through textiles, through ritual, through lullabies and legends. They weren't philosophers with marble busts or generals with battle scars, but they carried memory, culture, continuity. Even in tragedy, their presence was undeniable. Consider Medea, a woman betrayed whose fury shook the stage, or Antigone, who defied a king to honor her brother. These weren't passive victims, they were emotional earthquakes. And while they lived in fiction, their truths reflected the real lives of women who bore injustice quietly, until they didn't. So let's be honest, if you were a modern woman dropped into ancient Greece, you might not last a day. Not because you're weak, but because the system was built to ignore your strength. You'd have no voice in politics, little autonomy, no access to education or protection under the law. And yet, the women who lived it, they found ways to thrive, to nurture, to resist. Sometimes survival is its own kind of rebellion. And the next time you see an old Greek vase painted with a woman spinning wool or cradling a child, look closer. That's not a minor character. That's the spine of the story. You're sitting under the sun on a hard stone bench, surrounded by thousands of others. The crowd is humming with anticipation. Below, the stage waits, an open semicircle backed by painted scenery and a towering structure called the skene. No curtains, no lights, just raw human drama and the gods as witnesses. Welcome to the theater of Dionysus. Now don't let the term theater fool you. This wasn't Friday night entertainment. It was ritual, civic duty, therapy. A way for the entire city, citizens, slaves, foreigners, even women, if they were allowed to watch, to stare directly into the mirror of their own messy humanity. In ancient Athens, drama was born not out of boredom, but out of worship. Plays were performed during the festival of Dionysia, a days-long celebration in honor of the god of wine, ecstasy, and transformation. Because Dionysus wasn't just about grapes and good times. He was the god of losing yourself, of tearing down the walls between order and chaos, self and other, man and beast. Fitting then that Greek drama loved to show people unraveling. The earliest plays were tragedies, and they weren't afraid to dive deep into the ugliest parts of the human soul. Murder, betrayal, incest, madness. These weren't plot twists. They were the bones of the genre. Why? Because tragedy wasn't just about shock. It was about catharsis. Aristotle would later define catharsis as the purging of pity and fear. You watched Oedipus blind himself or Medea destroy her children, and somehow, through the horror, you felt relief. Not because it was fun, but because it told you, you're not alone in your suffering. Others have walked through the fire too. And you might be wondering, if these stories were so intense, why would anyone want to watch them? Well, imagine a world with no therapists, no journals, no social media to vent your darkest thoughts. The theater was your release. It was where you confronted fate, wrestled with justice, and mourned what couldn't be undone, all in a communal space together. But here's the twist. The actors were all men. Even female roles were played by men in masks. And those masks, they weren't just disguises. They were emotional amplifiers. Oversized features helped the audience see expressions from a distance, but they also symbolized something deeper. The idea that in drama, you're never just oneself. You're many. You wear your joy, your rage, your grief like a costume, just like in life. Behind those masks, the great tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides crafted stories that still haunt us. Aeschylus gave us the Oresteia, a trilogy of blood and justice that ends with the invention of the court system. Sophocles wrote Antigone, the tale of a woman who defies a king to bury her brother, choosing divine law over human tyranny. And Euripides, he was the wild card, the one who dared to ask if the gods themselves were flawed. Take the Bacchae, his chilling play about Dionysus. It's not a celebration, it's a warning. When a king mocks the god of ecstasy, Dionysus drives the women of the city into a frenzy so deep they tear him limb from limb. It's not subtle, it's raw. It says, deny your emotions, your wildness, your need for release, and the consequences will destroy you. But theater wasn't all tragedy. After all that emotional heaviness, the Greeks knew you needed a laugh. Enter comedy. And not the stand-up kind. We're talking Aristophanes, a playwright who used raunchy jokes, biting satire, and surreal plots to roast everyone from politicians to philosophers. In Lysistrata, the women of Greece withhold sex until their husbands agree to end the war. It's hilarious, yes, but it's also a sharp critique of militarism and gender roles. Greek comedy loved to break the fourth wall. Characters spoke directly to the audience, mocked real public figures, and turned society inside out for the sake of a good belly laugh. It wasn't escapism. It was confrontation, just in a funnier outfit. And here's what's wild. All these plays, comedies, and tragedies alike were part of competitions. Playwrights submitted their scripts. Judges ranked them. The winners were honored, the losers humiliated. Art was serious business. The city-state itself sponsored the productions, and wealthy patrons funded the chorus as a kind of civic duty. It was expensive, elaborate, and deeply political. Imagine a world where your government not only allowed, but required you to think deeply about justice, grief, and absurdity, through song and dance and shouting men in oversized masks. That was ancient Greece, but it's easy to romanticize all this to think, wow, what a cultured, emotionally intelligent society. And in some ways it was, but let's not forget. While the stage welcomed intense emotion and radical ideas, the actual society was rigid, patriarchal, and often brutal. The theater gave voice to women, slaves, and foreigners on stage, but not in law. The irony was baked into the very stones of the amphitheater. You could feel sympathy for Antigone, but a real woman who tried the same defiance. She'd be silenced. You could weep for a slave on stage, but in real life, slavery was normal and unquestioned. The stage was both mirror and mask, a place where truth could be told as long as it didn't disrupt the real power. Still, it meant something. It still means something, because we're still staging these plays, still quoting their lines, still feeling that strange relief when tragedy lets us cry or when comedy helps us laugh through pain. The Greeks didn't just invent drama. They understood something fundamental, that humans need stories to make sense of suffering, that putting on a mask can reveal your truest self, and that sometimes the only way to survive a world full of chaos is to sit in a crowd, watch someone fall apart and think, thank God it's not me. Or maybe, that could be me. Let's say you survived the sleepless heat of a Greek bedroom, managed to swallow a breakfast of barley mush and sour wine, scraped yourself clean with olive oil and a bronze blade, and now, after attending a tragic bloodbath at the theater, you've decided to do something even riskier with your afternoon. Think, because here in ancient Greece, thinking isn't just a hobby, it's an extreme sport. And the local champions, names you've heard echo across millennia, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. But don't picture a quiet library or a college seminar with iced coffee and gentle nods. Philosophy in ancient Athens was loud, confrontational, and relentless. You want to talk about ethics, politics, the meaning of justice. Get ready to argue for your life. The agora, the public square, is your battlefield. It's crowded, noisy, dusty, filled with merchants shouting prices, children weaving between legs, and philosophers standing on crates grilling strangers with impossible questions. You don't sit back and absorb ideas. You defend them. You bleed for them. And if your logic has holes, someone like Socrates will find them, pry them open, and leave your confidence in ruins. Let's meet him, shall we? Socrates didn't write a single word, but his method, the Socratic method, is still taught today. And it's basically this: keep asking why until the person you're talking to crumbles. He questioned everything. What is courage? What is justice? What does it mean to live a good life? But he didn't give answers. He turned your beliefs inside out until you didn't know which way was up. and that made him dangerous. The government of Athens eventually sentenced Socrates to death for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the city. His real crime: making people uncomfortable. Too many citizens had their self-certainty stripped away in front of a crowd. Socrates wasn't a criminal. He was a mirror, and not everyone liked what they saw. He drank the hemlock willingly. No escape, no fight. Just one last lesson. The examined life is worth living, but sometimes it's also worth dying for. Now, fast forward to his student, Plato. More than just a philosopher, Plato was a frustrated dreamer trying to make sense of a broken world. After watching democracy kill his mentor, he lost faith in popular rule. Instead, he imagined a city governed by philosopher kings, rational, just, immune to the corruptions of emotion and greed. His most famous work, The Republic, is still debated today. He wrote it like a play, dialogues between characters discussing justice, truth, and the soul. And if you ever studied philosophy, you've heard of the cave, Plato's metaphor for ignorance. Prisoners sit chained, watching shadows on a wall, thinking those shadows are reality. One escapes, sees the sun, and realizes the truth. But when he returns to free the others, they don't thank him. They want him dead, because truth hurts. And that brings us to Aristotle, Plato's student, and the man who decided maybe it's time to bring philosophy down to earth. Aristotle believed in observing the real world. He cataloged plants, studied animals, analyzed governments, mapped logic, and defined ethics. He wasn't just a thinker, he was a system builder. To him, a good life wasn't about grand theory, it was about practice, virtue, balance, the golden mean. You shouldn't be a coward or a fool, you should find the space in between. Moderation in all things. Want to be brave, practice bravery. Over time, it becomes who you are. If Plato built castles in the clouds, Aristotle built roads through the dust. And yet, even Aristotle couldn't escape the limits of his era. His views on women were dismissive, his approval of slavery appalling. These were brilliant minds, yes, but they were also products of their time, and their rational conclusions could be soaked in prejudice. That's the paradox of Greek thought. On one hand, it gave us the very foundations of Western reasoning: logic, metaphysics, ethics. On the other hand, it often ignored or outright oppressed those who didn't fit its narrow definition of citizen. Women, for example, were largely excluded from philosophical life. No matter how sharp their minds, their voices were rarely heard in the public square. One rare exception: Hypatia, though she came centuries later in Rome and Egypt. Her philosophical lineage drew from Greek roots, and her story ended with a mob. A woman teaching reason was still too much for the world to bear. And if you think the exclusion was just gender-based, think again. Most Greeks didn't consider foreigners capable of reason. Barbarians, they called them, anyone who didn't speak Greek. Even their word for barbarian mimicked how other languages sounded to their ears: barbar. It was intellectual gatekeeping, dressed in robes. Still, there was something undeniably powerful in the Greek hunger for truth. In a world ruled by myth, they dared to ask why. They stripped the gods of thunderbolts and tried to find order in nature, in ethics, in the soul. They believed that through dialogue, you could shape a better human. Not through bloodline, but through logos, reason. But make no mistake, it wasn't a calm, quiet process. Imagine spending your afternoon debating whether the soul exists, only to realize your opponent just backed you into a logical corner. There are no mics to drop, just bruised egos and dust in your sandals. And yet, you come back the next day, because there's something addictive about it. That moment when someone says something that shifts the way you see the world. When an idea strikes you so hard it knocks the breath out of your chest. That's philosophy, not as a class but as a fight. A fight worth losing. A fight that makes you better. Imagine standing in formation, shoulder to shoulder with 100 other men. The brassy taste of fear drying your mouth faster than the summer heat. You're holding a spear so long it feels more like a tree than a weapon, and a round bronze shield that weighs as much as a modern carry-on suitcase. But it's not just protection, it's responsibility. Because here's the thing about the phalanx. It only works if everyone does their job. It's not about flashy one-on-one swordplay. This isn't a duel. This is unity, locked together in tight lines. Every man's shield protecting the one next to him. If you run, the formation breaks. If you fall, someone else becomes exposed. Your body is part of a wall, living, breathing, sweating metal and flesh. And when the command comes, you don't charge like in the movies. You push. Slow, deliberate. The spears angle forward. Your sandals slide over gravel and dirt. The man beside you grunts, his shoulder grinding into yours. Your vision is blocked by his shield, your movement limited by the pack of bodies behind you. Then the clash. It's not graceful. It's a mess of stabbing, shouting, and slipping on blood-slick ground. The enemy is doing the same thing, trying to hold the line, shove forward, jab their spears over their shields. It's terrifyingly intimate. You hear their breath. You feel the tremble in their arms when your weapons meet. There are no long-range arrows or fancy strategy here, just grit and death. It doesn't look like it does in paintings. Some men are skewered instantly. Others collapse under the weight of trampling feet. A broken leg might mean suffocation, not bleeding out. If you fall and your side is still pushing forward, you'll be trampled. If you panic and turn your back, you expose the man next to you, and that could cost him his life. Cowardice isn't just dishonorable, it's contagious. One crack in the wall and the whole thing falls apart. That's why Greek soldiers, hoplites, trained relentlessly, not just for strength but for trust. You had to believe the man beside you would hold the line, even when chaos exploded around you. Now let's rewind a bit back to the beginning of your day. Before the battle, you'd wake up with a tight knot in your stomach. Not fear exactly, though that's there, but anticipation. You'd eat a light meal, maybe stale bread, olives, and some dried figs. Nothing heavy. You'd oil your body to keep muscles loose. And if you were religious, and most Greeks were, you'd offer prayers, sometimes even animal sacrifices, to Athena, Ares, or Apollo, depending on who you wanted watching your back. Then came the marching, miles of it, over rocky paths and uneven fields under a blinding sun. You carried not just your weapons, but your armor, helmet, breastplate, shin guards, all together, nearly 70 pounds. No horses, no chariots, You walk in rows in heat, and if you stumbled, that was your problem. The unit keeps moving. By the time you reach the battlefield, your feet are raw, your shoulders sore, and the metallic scent of oil and sweat is clinging to everyone like a second skin. You're not clean, you're not heroic, you're exhausted, and the real battle hasn't even started. Now here's a bit of brutal honesty. If you're not rich, your gear might be second-hand. Your shield might be cracked, your sandals thin. The rich get the best armor. The poor, they make do. This isn't modern military equality. This is ancient Greece. You fight because you're expected to, not because you're well equipped. And don't even think about running. In many city-states, Sparta especially, cowardice in battle meant disgrace, not just for you but your entire family. A man who fled could be branded for life, denied marriage, or even exiled. In Sparta, women mocked cowards. Mothers told their sons, "Come back with your shield or on it." Think that's dramatic? It's not. In a society where honor is everything, a stain on your courage was worse than death. In some cases, it was death, handed down by your own people. So you push forward through fear, heat, and exhaustion. The battle might last an hour or several. It's not always clear who's winning. All you know is what's happening right in front of you. Spear tips flashing, screams echoing, dust choking the air. And when it ends, it doesn't end clean. If your side wins, you're expected to chase the enemy, kill stragglers, and sometimes burn their camp. If you lose, you either flee, surrender, or die. Wounded men aren't carried off the field. There's no field medics, no evacuation helicopters. If your injury isn't fatal, it still might become infected and kill you later. If you're lucky, someone ties a rag around it. If you're unlucky, well, ancient Greek medicine wasn't exactly known for its painkillers. Now imagine this isn't once in a lifetime. It's every few years or more. Your city-state feuds with its neighbors and you're called up again and again. You're not a full-time soldier. You might be a farmer, a blacksmith, or a merchant in peacetime. But when the trumpet calls, you become a hoplite. And when the war ends, if it ends, you go home with scars. Some visible, some not. Maybe you return to your field and pretend it didn't happen. Maybe you limp. Maybe you can't sleep through the night anymore. But ancient Greece has no word for PTSD. No counseling. You drink wine and try not to remember. Here's what most people forget. The glory of war in ancient Greece was mostly reserved for the poets. In real life, it was sweat, fear, heat stroke, and death. There were no parades, no medals. Just the hope that your family would survive, that your name would be remembered, and that the gods, fickle as they were, might spare you one more time. And that's why most modern folks wouldn't last a day in ancient Greece. So you've survived the heat, the walking, maybe even battle. Now you're back home, assuming you're not a slave, a servant, or still dragging your busted sandal across the agora. It's late, you're hungry, but dinner, it's not waiting for you hot and fresh. If anything, you're expected to help make it. In most Greek households, especially those of modest means, women did the cooking. Not because they had a culinary passion, but because it was their job, period. If you were a man, you didn't step into the kitchen. If you were a woman, you probably never stepped out of it. And no, There weren't copper pots or fancy ingredients lined up on a shelf like a Food Network show. Most Greek homes had a simple hearth, a clay or stone cooking area where food was prepared over coals or small flames. No chimneys, just smoke. If you were lucky, the house had a small courtyard to keep the smoke from suffocating everyone. If not, enjoy your eye-watering appetizer of carbon monoxide. Now what's for dinner? For the average citizen, the main event was barley. Again, barley wasn't just for breakfast, it was for lunch and dinner too. You might eat it in the form of maza, that dense, chewy cake we mentioned earlier, or in a thin gruel. Occasionally it was baked into bread, but even that wasn't fluffy or soft. Think chewy, tough, and dry. If you had a few coins to spare, you might add lentils or chickpeas, boiled, salted, maybe seasoned with garlic. They were filling, yes, but not exactly thrilling. This wasn't Mediterranean luxury. This was survival food, cooked slow over uneven heat, stirred with a wooden spoon and served in clay bowls. Meat, rare. Unless there was a festival, a wedding, or a religious sacrifice, meat was scarce. And even then, you weren't getting the fillet. Wealthy priests or officials often got the best cuts. Maybe a scrap of liver, a few bones, or whatever could be boiled into a stew. Most Greeks went weeks, sometimes months, without eating animal flesh. Fish was more common, especially in coastal cities. But again, price mattered. The rich could afford delicacies like red mullet or tuna. The poor, they got sardines, anchovies, or dried fish pastes. That's right, fish paste, a fermented, salty mash used as a sauce. Not exactly five-star fare. Now let's talk veggies. Ancient Greeks were actually pretty good about including greens in their meals. Wild herbs, onions, garlic, leeks, and cabbage. These were usually boiled or eaten raw, sometimes mixed with vinegar or wine. Tomatoes, potatoes, sorry, those wouldn't show up in Europe for another 2,000 years. So you made do with bitter greens and root vegetables. And cheese. Yes, but it was mostly goat cheese, soft, tangy, and not something you'd find on a charcuterie board today. You might crumble it over bread or lentils if you had some. Olives and olive oil were more widely available and often used as toppings or dips. But again, quantity was everything. Most meals were small, repetitive, and purely functional. So what about wine? Oh, there was wine, but not the kind you're imagining. Greek wine was thick, strong, and always watered down, sometimes by a ratio of 1:3. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric, literally. Only foreigners and fools drank undiluted wine. It wasn't about getting drunk, at least not always. It was about flavor, custom, and social balance. And while we're on the subject, who got to drink wine and eat together? Well, if you were a man, you probably ate reclining with other men, especially if you were wealthy. In elite households, you might attend a symposium, a formal dinner party involving philosophy, music, storytelling, and yes, drinking. But it wasn't all fun and games. These events were also displays of status and intellect. You debated, you competed in riddles, you recited poetry, you showed off. If you were a woman, unless you were a musician or entertainer like a hetera, you weren't invited. In fact, most women ate separately, often in another room with children or other female relatives. Even in their own homes, women were excluded from the main event. They cooked, served, and then ate last, not out of neglect, but out of tradition. And if you were a slave, you didn't sit, you didn't recline, you served, you cleaned. You slept on the kitchen floor or in a shed after making sure everyone else was fed. Now let's pause for a second, because here's something wild. Ancient Greek culture placed enormous value on hospitality. It was practically sacred. If a stranger knocked on your door, tradition demanded you offer them food, shelter, and a bath, no questions asked. This idea, called xenia, was a moral obligation, and violating it could offend the gods. But hospitality to outsiders didn't mean luxury at home. The everyday dining experience was deeply structured by gender, class, and status. There was no table where everyone gathered equally, no democratic dinner. Meals reinforced the social order just like everything else in ancient Greece. So if you thought dinner was the relaxing end of your difficult day, think again. You sat on a cushion, maybe on the floor, balancing a clay bowl of barley, a bit of lentils, maybe a smear of cheese or a few olives. You drank thin wine. You spoke softly if you spoke at all. And then you went to bed, likely on the same mat or straw you woke up on. And guess what? You do it all again tomorrow. Because in ancient Greece, survival wasn't a moment, it was a rhythm. You woke early, worked hard, ate little, and followed a rigid structure that defined your place in the world, man or woman, rich or poor, free or slave. And that's another reason why most modern folks wouldn't last a single day. So you've wrapped up dinner, barely enough to quiet the rumble in your belly, and now you're settling in for the evening. But before you drift off to sleep on your straw mat, you pause. Because in ancient Greece, your day didn't just end with food and fatigue. It ended with the divine. Everything in your life was under the watchful eye of the gods. Felt a chill wind at sunset? That's Zeus reminding you who controls the skies. Stubbed your toe on a rock? Maybe Ares is irritated. Your neighbor's goat gave birth to twins. Must be a blessing from Artemis. The ancient Greeks didn't separate religion from daily life. It was daily life. You didn't just believe in the gods. You lived with them. You feared them. You tried to please them. And you were constantly reading signs, dreams, birds in flight, sudden weather changes as possible messages from above. This wasn't optional. This was survival. Let's start with the household gods. Even in the humblest homes, there was a small shrine, usually near the hearth, dedicated to Hestia, goddess of the home and the sacred flame. Her fire was never supposed to go out. Letting the hearth die, that was more than a bad habit. It was practically sacrilege. So every morning you'd light incense, offer a little bread, pour a bit of wine onto the ground. You didn't need a priest for this. You did it yourself, quietly, respectfully, because if you did, well, who knows what misfortune might follow. And then there were larger rituals, sacrifices and festivals, public events that pulled entire cities into divine service. Want a good harvest? Better offer a goat to Demeter. Want safe travels? Sacrifice to Poseidon. Want victory in court? A few coins to Athena wouldn't hurt. And yes, when we say sacrifice, we're talking about animals. Sheep, pigs, oxen, depending on the god and how much you could afford. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were bloody, loud, and very real. The best parts of the meat went to the gods, burned on the altar. The rest might be shared in a communal feast, but the point wasn't dinner, it was reverence. Now imagine waking up every day wondering, did I forget to honor someone? That fear wasn't paranoia, it was baked into the culture. Because the gods didn't just bless, they punished. Take Arachne, the woman who dared to outweave Athena. She got turned into a spider. Or Niobe, who bragged about having more children than Leto, mother of Apollo and Artemis. Result: all her kids were killed. Oops. Even simple acts had spiritual weight. Going on a journey, you might stop and pray at a herm, a carved stone pillar dedicated to Hermes. Entering a new city, better make an offering at the gate. Giving birth, planting crops, buying a slave, even bathing in a river, every act had a divine angle. And don't even think about omens. They were everywhere. A sneeze at the wrong moment, bad luck. A dog howling at the moon, definitely bad luck. A dream where your teeth fall out, forget it. You might not leave the house for a week. People consulted oracles for life's biggest decisions. The most famous, of course, was the Oracle of Delphi, where the priestess Pythia sat above a steaming fissure and delivered Apollo's words in riddles. Kings, generals, even average farmers might travel for days just to hear her advice. But oracles weren't the only spiritual specialists. There were seers, augurs, and even necromancers. Yes, people who claimed to speak with the dead. If you couldn't afford a trip to Delphi, maybe you'd settle for a local priest who read bird flight patterns or examined goat entrails for meaning. And if this sounds exhausting, it was. Because faith wasn't just personal, it was political. Whole cities competed to prove their devotion. Athens had the Panathenaea, a massive festival to honor Athena. There were parades, races, sacrifices, and even poetry contests. Not just for fun, but to show unity, strength, and loyalty to the gods who watched over the polis. If the gods smiled on your city, you'd have rain, safety, children, crops. If they did, famine, war, plague. And people would start asking, who angered them? Sometimes that blame fell on a scapegoat, literally. In certain festivals, a person might be chosen to carry the sins of the city. They'd be paraded, mocked, beaten, and sometimes expelled or even executed, all to restore balance and favor. Now you might be thinking, did the Greeks really believe all this? Yes and no. Some philosophers, like Socrates or Plato, questioned the literal truth of the myths, but they still respected the rituals. Religion wasn't about personal salvation. It was about keeping cosmic order. It kept you in your place. It explained the unexplainable, and it bound the community together in a shared rhythm of fear and celebration. And here's the real kicker. There was no sacred book, no Bible, no Quran, no central scripture. Just poetry, plays, and stories passed down by bards and dramatists. Homer, Hesiod, Aeschylus, Sophocles, these were the spiritual teachers. Their verses carried the morals, the warnings, and the wisdom. And those lessons, they were harsh. Pride gets punished. Greed invites ruin. Hubris brings the gods crashing down on your head. And still, people lived with faith, not in comfort, but in complexity. They didn't demand certainty. They accepted mystery. They respected the chaos, and they did their best to survive within it. So now, imagine you waking up in that world, where every sneeze matters, where a bad dream could cancel your plans, and where forgetting to honor a minor river spirit might mean drowning in a storm. Still think you'd last a day, so you've made your offering at the household shrine. You've prayed to every god that matters and a few just in case. But now, the olives you had for lunch are catching up to you. Nature calls. And here's the thing. There's no private bathroom, no porcelain throne, no scented candle on the windowsill, just a clay pot, a communal bench, or, if you're lucky, a public latrine with stone seats that may or may not be warmed by the sun. Ancient Greece didn't quite invent the modern toilet. Most people used chamber pots, which were small ceramic containers that you do your business in, and then carry outside, often dumping the contents into the street or a designated waste area. Yes, the street. This wasn't considered disgusting. It was normal. In fact, city streets in Athens often doubled as drainage systems. Rain would wash the waste away, ideally. If it didn't rain for a while, though, let's just say you learned to watch where you stepped. Now, if you were in a wealthier district, or visiting a gymnasium, bathhouse, or public gathering space, you might find a public latrine. Picture a long bench with holes in it, carved into a slab of stone with a drainage trench running underneath. No stalls, no doors, just you and a dozen strangers sitting side by side, trying not to make eye contact. What about wiping? Ah, yes, the infamous question, toilet paper. Not a thing. Instead, ancient Greeks might use small pebbles called pes, or broken bits of pottery. That's right, shards of clay repurposed for personal hygiene. It sounds horrifying, but some scholars think the smoother ones were used, and they might have been rinsed and reused. Still, it's hard to romanticize philosophy when you're squatting over a hole and reaching for a rock. Some wealthier citizens used cloth or wool scraps, but those were luxuries. Most just got by however they could. There's even evidence that some people used sponges tied to sticks, but that practice was more common in Roman times. Let's say you've survived the experience. You've wiped, you've dumped the pot, and you're still upright. Now comes cleaning up. Remember, there's no soap, no hot water on tap, no hand sanitizer. You might rinse your hands at a fountain, but only if one's nearby. And unless you're heading to the gymnasium or bathhouse, that might be the most you get. Which brings us to another daily ordeal, bathing. Unlike the Romans, the Greeks didn't build elaborate public baths in every neighborhood. In fact, bathing wasn't something everyone did every day. It was often tied to exercise, rituals, or major life events. A typical bath involved cold water poured over the body, often from a large clay jug in a courtyard or a public fountain. You'd rub yourself with olive oil, then scrape it off using a strigil, a curved metal scraper, to remove sweat and grime. It worked sort of, but the aftersmell was a heady mix of oil, body odor, and whatever your tunic had soaked up that week. There were no shampoos, no scented body wash, no eucalyptus steam rooms. Deodorant? Not really. Perfumes existed, scented oils like myrrh or rose water, but they were expensive and usually reserved for the elite or for ceremonial use. For everyone else, smelling less bad was the goal. And what about dental hygiene? Brace yourself. There were no toothbrushes or toothpaste. Instead, people chewed on twigs, rubbed their teeth with crushed charcoal, or rinsed with vinegar. Some ancient sources suggest using ash as a cleaning agent. Effective? Maybe. Pleasant? Definitely not. Tooth decay was common. So were missing teeth. And let's just say breath mints weren't on the shopping list. Now here's a twist. While personal hygiene might sound primitive, appearance still mattered deeply. Greeks took pride in grooming. Men trimmed their beards with knives or razors and often visited barber shops which doubled as gossip hubs. Women curled their hair with hot irons, used natural dyes like saffron or henna, and applied rudimentary makeup. White lead for the face, yes, lead. Coal for the eyes, crushed berries for the lips. But remember, mirrors were polished metal, not glass. You saw a ghost of your face, not a selfie-ready reflection. And if your tunic smelled like sweat and goat, well, so did everyone else. Still, even in this gritty world of dust and sweat, Greeks believed in balance, body and mind. A healthy appearance wasn't just for show. It reflected inner virtue, self-discipline, and harmony with the cosmos. So you might scrape yourself clean with a dull blade and splash your face with cold water. But in doing so, you were honoring a deeper ideal, Kallikagathia, the unity of the beautiful and the good. And that might be the biggest irony. For a culture that gave us some of the world's highest ideals of beauty, reason, and order, it didn't give us plumbing. So next time you flush a toilet, brush your teeth, or shower off the day, remember this. In ancient Greece, survival wasn't just about war or philosophy. It was about mastering discomfort, and doing so with dignity. So you've worked, you've sweated, you've maybe offended the nostrils of the gods, and now it's nightfall. The heat softens, the city grows quieter, and the flicker of oil lamps begins to dance across courtyards and tiled roofs. But if you think the Greeks just crawled into bed at sundown, not quite. Because this is when the real drama begins, sometimes literally. Let's start with the theater, one of the crown jewels of Greek civilization. But before you imagine red curtains and padded seats, let's set the record straight. The Greek theater was open air, carved into hillsides, and could hold tens of thousands of people. That's right, an entire polis packed onto stone steps to watch actors wear masks, chant poetic verses, and sometimes fake a death or two. And no, these weren't casual shows. Attending theater in Athens, especially during festivals like the Dionysia, was a civic duty. Plays were funded by wealthy citizens as a public service. It wasn't entertainment. It was religion, education, and cultural flexing rolled into one. You'd see tragedies by Sophocles or Euripides, where noble heroes were brought low by fate, or comedies by Aristophanes, where satire flew like olive pits and even the gods weren't safe from mockery. The humor, often crude, the plots, involving, the themes, still relevant, power, pride, love, revenge, and the audience, rowdy. Don't think for a second that ancient Greeks watched in polite silence. They booed, they cheered, they heckled. If a play was bad, you knew it. If it was good, it could win a prize and immortality. But theater was just the start. When Greeks really wanted to cut loose, They turned to symposiums, part dinner party, part intellectual salon, part wine-fueled karaoke night. Only men attended usually, and these weren't just about guzzling wine, though there was plenty of that. They were structured events with rules, rituals, and sometimes games like catabos, where you flung dregs of wine at a target across the room. Picture frat party meets philosophical debate. At a symposium, guests reclined on couches in a circle. Wine was mixed with water, always diluted, and served by symposiarchs, the elected wine master of the night. Drink too little and you were boring. Too much and you embarrassed yourself. The goal: to get just drunk enough to spark conversation, poetry, music, and maybe a little gentle mischief. Conversations wandered from the absurd to the divine. What is love? What is courage? What's the most heroic thing you've done drunk? Flutes played, dancers twirled, and sometimes visiting courtesans or entertainers joined in, blurring the line between discussion and performance. It wasn't just the elite who had fun. Ordinary people celebrated too, especially during festivals. There were dozens throughout the year: planting festivals, harvest festivals, religious rites, and civic holidays. Each with its own traditions, foods, and processions. The most infamous: the Dionysian festivals. Now Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and ecstasy, wasn't exactly a rules and order kind of deity. His festivals were wild. Think masked parades, phallic processions, yes, actual giant phalluses on carts, spontaneous singing and ecstatic dancing. For one night, the boundaries of class, gender, and behavior dissolved. Women, especially those confined to the home, sometimes joined Bacchic rites in the countryside. There, far from city eyes, they danced, drank, and invoked the god in a ritual meant to shatter the normal and invite the divine. It sounds wild. It was. But it also served a purpose: to release the pressures of daily life, to honor a god who represented chaos, rebirth, and the raw edge of emotion. Even kids got in on the action. Young boys were trained in music, poetry, and athletics, not just as hobbies but as moral development. The ideal man, the kalos kagathos, was good in body and noble in spirit. Singing, dancing, and storytelling weren't distractions. They were seen as essential threads in the fabric of a well-lived life. And if you were a woman, well, your options were narrower. Public celebrations often excluded women. But within their own circles, especially among priestesses or aristocratic households, music and storytelling flourished. Women sang lullabies, led household rites, and passed on myths with rhythm and care. And if you lived in a place like Lesbos, your community might revere female poets and performers. More on that soon. Because Greek culture wasn't just physical, it was profoundly emotional. Tragedy, longing, desire, these weren't taboo topics. They were front and center, which brings us to the lyric poets like Sappho of Lesbos. Her songs weren't about gods or wars. They were about feeling, a tremble in the hand, a sideways glance, the pain of love that's not returned. Sappho wrote not as an observer but as someone who lived inside each emotion. Her verses, often accompanied by a lyre, were short, intimate, and whispered like secrets. Imagine sitting in a candle-lit room, the scent of olive oil in the air, as a woman's voice drifts across the silence. He is equal to the gods, that man who sits beside you. In just a few lines, Sappho could make you ache. Her words still do, but not everyone appreciated that honesty. As time passed, her poems, especially those that celebrated love between women, were censored, twisted, or lost. The Library of Alexandria, where her works were kept, burned. Later scholars rewrote her life to make it more palatable to patriarchal sensibilities. Myths emerged that she leapt to her death over a man. None of it was true, but the legend overtook the reality. Yet Sappho's spirit survived in fragments, in whispers, in the roots of words like lesbian and sapphic. Her poetry, raw and human, reminded the world that the Greeks didn't just think, they felt. So why wouldn't you last a day in ancient Greece? Because beneath all the marble statues and philosophical treatises lies a world so nakedly emotional, so brutally honest, so alive, that most of us, used to hiding behind digital screens and polite conversation, wouldn't know what to do with it. Imagine a dusty, open square buzzing with energy, the agora. This wasn't just a market. It was the beating heart of Greek democracy, commerce, philosophy, and everyday drama. Here you could buy olives, debate tax policy, listen to a traveling poet, or accidentally get tangled up in a very public trial. And trials, oh, they didn't happen behind closed doors with professional lawyers. Nope. In Athens, justice was theater. Citizens gathered in open courts, sometimes hundreds at a time, sitting on stone benches or wooden platforms. No fancy robes, no jury box, just a bunch of fellow citizens who'd rather be drinking watered-down wine, now holding your fate in their dusty hands. And you had to defend yourself. That's right, no attorneys. You wrote your own speech, memorized it, and delivered it in front of a crowd of your peers. If you stuttered, tough. If you forgot your lines, better hope pity works. If your opponent was cleverer with their words, you might lose your land, your wealth, or your freedom. Sound terrifying. It was. This wasn't about volume or charisma alone, though those helped. It was about structure, rhythm, logic, and above all, pathos. The Greeks understood something we're still catching up on, that the best argument isn't just smart, it's emotional. The greatest orators didn't just lay out facts. They performed pain, channeled virtue, spoke with the kind of fire that could move crowds and change laws. Take Demosthenes, one of the most famous orators in Athenian history. As a young man, he had a speech impediment. Did he give up? No. He literally trained his tongue by shouting into the wind and speaking with pebbles in his mouth. Why? Because in Athens, if you couldn't speak, you couldn't lead. You couldn't even survive. Even Socrates, the philosopher we love to romanticize, got caught in this brutal system. His crime, corrupting the youth and questioning the gods. His punishment, death by hemlock, the kicker. He didn't run, didn't beg. He stood in front of a jury of his peers and spoke with such calm defiance that it sealed his fate. It wasn't just a speech, it was a philosophical mic drop. But here's the thing. Public speaking wasn't limited to the courts. It was everywhere in politics, military commands, even in philosophy. If you wanted to sway the assembly, you had to grip their hearts with words. If you wanted to rise in the military, you had to inspire loyalty with your voice. There was no escaping it. And don't think this pressure only hit the elite. Even average citizens were expected to participate in the assembly, the cornerstone of Athenian democracy. Every free male over the age of 18 had the right, and some would say the obligation, to show up, vote on laws, debate foreign policy, or yell at their neighbors about grain prices. It sounds empowering, but imagine being a farmer who's barely slept, who just walked 2 miles in sandals, and now has to vote on naval strategy. You'd better hope you weren't swayed by the loudest guy in the room. The system was messy, chaotic, and imperfect, but it was revolutionary. Now, of course, not everyone got a voice. Women were excluded. Enslaved people, who made up a significant portion of the population, had no rights at all. Foreigners, even long-term residents, were often barred from political life. The democracy we talk about, it was built on a foundation of exclusions. And yet, within that flawed framework, the Greeks were obsessed with freedom of speech. They even had a word for it: parrhesia, the right, even the duty to speak freely, especially when it was uncomfortable. Philosophers considered it a virtue. Orators wielded it like a sword. Citizens, when brave enough, used it to challenge corruption and hold power accountable. But parrhesia came with a cost. Speaking your truth could get you exiled, punished, or worse. Just ask Socrates. Still, the Greeks believed in the power of language. They saw it as a civic act, a moral responsibility. And in that way, their world feels oddly familiar. Social media, online debates, political rants were still wrestling with the same questions. Who gets to speak? What's the cost of truth? And can words still move people? But if you thought surviving a courtroom or the assembly was rough, let's talk about daily survival in other forms like medicine. Because when life threw you a broken bone, a fever, or a mysterious rash, you didn't have WebMD or urgent care. You had a man with a beard, a knife, and a whole lot of theories about humors. So you wake up one morning with a pounding headache, a swollen knee, and a weird black spot on your toe. Who do you call? Well, there's no doctor's office, no Tylenol, no antibiotics, your best shot. A local iatros, a healer who might be part scientist, part philosopher, and part herbal witch. And if you lived in a rural area, you might just be relying on your grandma's favorite poultice recipe involving fig paste, boiled vinegar, and possibly, yes, crushed beetles. Now, before we laugh too hard, let's give credit where it's due. The Greeks didn't just randomly throw herbs at sick people, at least not always. They were among the first to think disease might not be punishment from the gods, but instead something natural, something explainable, something treatable. This radical idea was championed by one of the most legendary names in medical history, Hippocrates. You've probably heard of the Hippocratic Oath, the pledge that modern doctors take to do no harm. That comes from him, or at least his school of thought. Hippocrates and his followers believed in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, they thought your humors were out of balance. Maybe you had too much phlegm and needed to warm up. Maybe you had too much black bile and needed a good purge. Sound weird, sure, but this theory stuck around for centuries. And their treatments, oh, they ranged from brilliant to brutal. Let's say you had a fever. You might be told to rest in a shady spot, drink cool water, and eat boiled greens. That's not terrible, but if your illness dragged on, they might bleed you, literally cut open a vein to release the excess heat. Got a chest infection? Try some mustard seed, honey, and maybe a smoke enema. Yeah, a smoke enema. Now picture surgery. No anesthesia. No sterilization. No sutures as we know them. The only painkiller, maybe some wine. If you needed a limb reset, a broken bone set, or a spear removed from your thigh, you just braced yourself and screamed into the wind. But here's the wild part. Some of their methods actually worked. Greek physicians were keen observers. They took notes. They made connections. They tracked symptoms and tried to classify diseases. They understood that environment and lifestyle played a role in health. They were big on diet, exercise, and sleep. In fact, Hippocrates wrote that walking is man's best medicine. They even performed rudimentary surgeries, trepanation, where they drilled a hole in the skull to relieve pressure. It sounds medieval, but it's been found in ancient remains across the world. Sometimes it worked. But not all healers were cut from Hippocratic cloth. Many doctors were actually traveling quacks, showing up with miracle cures and mystery potions. They'd perform in public squares. Think ancient snake oil salesmen grinding herbs, chanting incantations, offering to fix your bad back or your broken marriage, all in the same sitting. And if you were desperate, you listened. Because when your child had a high fever or your father was coughing up blood, you didn't have a choice. You prayed, you paid, you hoped. For many Greeks, healing was just as much spiritual as it was physical. Enter the Asclepians, temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. These were part clinic, part church, part wellness retreat. You'd show up, offer a sacrifice, maybe a rooster or some bread, and then lie down to sleep in the hope that Asclepius would appear in a dream and tell you how to heal. People wrote testimonials about being healed of blindness, tumors, even paralysis. Were they real? Were they the placebo effect? Who knows? But these temple hospitals were packed with visitors from all over the Greek world. And yes, they had snakes. Non-venomous snakes slithered freely through the temples, symbols of renewal and healing. Imagine trying to fall asleep while a sacred serpent wriggles past your cot. Talk about pressure. Still, these temples were the closest thing to organized hospitals the ancient Greeks had. And the records we've found, carved into stone walls, are some of the earliest case studies in medical history. But for all their insights, Greek medicine had its limits. They didn't understand germs. They didn't grasp the immune system. Their best antibiotics were honey and wine. And during outbreaks, like the plague of Athens, which wiped out thousands, including the great Pericles, their treatments were powerless. In fact, that plague was so devastating that it changed Athenian politics, weakened the city's power, and shook public faith in the gods. It wasn't just a health crisis. It was a turning point in Greek history. So yes, the Greeks laid the foundation for Western medicine. But if you were actually sick back then, you'd better pray to Asclepius, drink your garlic potion, and hope your humors got the message. Hey guys. So here we are, standing at the end of a long, winding road through the sun-bleached temples, sweaty agoras, olive groves, and shadowed myths of ancient Greece. We've tasted their barley cakes, we've slept on straw mats, we've ducked the wrath of gods, and survived streets paved with more goat than grace. We've lived a day in sandals that were never meant for comfort, and yeah, we barely made it to sunset. And maybe that's the point. Because for all the legends and marble statues and golden philosophies, ancient Greece wasn't just about heroism. It was about endurance. It was about making it through one more scorching day, one more stone-hard meal, one more whisper from the gods that maybe, just maybe, you mattered. We saw how their lives were bound to rituals, how they sang to gods when they were scared, how they listened for omens in the wind, how they kept their dead close and their stories closer. And still, through all that struggle, they created things that outlived them. Poems, plays, architecture, ideas. They gave us democracy and also, let's be honest, one of the most inconvenient wardrobes in human history. But in every corner of their harsh world there was beauty. The kind that wasn't flashy. The kind that came from survival, from community, from trusting that somewhere out there in the stars or the sea or the silence of a dusty courtyard, the universe was still listening. And if there's one thing we can carry with us, it's this. You don't have to be a philosopher to ask questions. You don't have to be a warrior to endure. And you don't have to be a poet to feel deeply. You just have to be alive. And ancient Greece, for all its fire and fury, understood that life, in all its messy, flawed, aching humanness, was worth remembering. So tonight, as you lay your head down, hopefully not on straw, think of those who came before. The ones who wrote by lamplight, who watched the stars for meaning, who faced impossible days with quiet resilience. And if you feel a little more connected, a little less alone in time, well, then the journey was worth it. Thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. I hope you're already half asleep, maybe dreaming of olive groves, moonlit islands, or a gentle breeze over Delphi. Until next time, sleep well and good night.